On October 23, 2077, at exactly 9:47 a.m., the world ended in nuclear fire. 2 hours later, over 400 million people were dead, and human civilization had collapsed into radioactive ash. But this is not the story of how the world ended. This is the story of what came before and what came after, across 4 centuries of technological triumph and atomic horror that would make the Great War seem like merely the intermission in humanity's greatest tragedy. What you're about to hear is the complete timeline of the Fallout universe, from the resource wars that began in 2052 to the synthetic nightmares of 2287. Every Vault experiment, every corporate conspiracy, every godlike technology that humanity created to destroy itself. This is a world where atomic-powered cars shared the roads with nuclear-powered robots, where corporations planned the systematic torture of entire populations, and where the promise of a better tomorrow was always one mushroom cloud away from becoming humanity's funeral pyre. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The Great War wasn't an accident. It wasn't even really a war. It was the final stage of the largest social experiment ever conducted, orchestrated by corporations and shadow governments who saw nuclear apocalypse not as humanity's end, but as its necessary rebirth. They built 122 underground vaults across America, telling the public they were shelters. In reality, they were laboratories designed to test how far human beings could be pushed, broken, and remade in preparation for something far worse than nuclear war. The pre-war world looked like paradise. Gleaming chrome robots served cocktails while atomic cars hummed down highways, powered by miniature fusion reactors. The American dream had been achieved through the miracle of nuclear technology. Housewives cleaned their homes with atomic-powered vacuum cleaners. Children played with toy robots that could think and learn. Every appliance, every vehicle, every aspect of daily life had been transformed by the atom's promise of unlimited energy and boundless prosperity. Yet beneath this chrome and atomic veneer, the world was rotting from within. Global resources were depleting at an unprecedented rate. Oil reserves that had powered the 20th century were running dry by the 2050s, leading to the resource wars that would claim millions of lives across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Nations turned on each other like starving animals, and the international cooperation that had prevented global catastrophe for decades crumbled into nationalist paranoia and corporate greed. The United States of America, seemingly immune to the chaos consuming the rest of the world, had achieved energy independence through nuclear fusion. While European cities burned and Middle Eastern oil fields became battlegrounds, Americans lived in a bubble of atomic prosperity. Their cars ran on fusion batteries. Their homes were powered by backyard nuclear reactors. Their military deployed soldiers in powered armor that could withstand direct hits from tank shells. America had become the technological god of a dying world. But gods, as history would prove, are often the most monstrous of all creators. The corporations that had built this atomic paradise had plans that extended far beyond profit margins and market dominance. Vault-Tec Corporation, ostensibly in the business of building fallout shelters, was actually conducting the largest psychological and biological research program in human history. Robco Industries wasn't just manufacturing robots for domestic use. They were developing artificial intelligences capable of managing entire civilizations. Wasteland wasn't just researching military applications for biological weapons. They were creating viruses that could fundamentally alter human DNA. And at the center of it all was a shadow government known only as the Enclave, comprised of the most powerful industrialists, military leaders, and politicians in America. They had a vision for the future that would make the horrors of the 20th century seem quaint by comparison. They believed that democracy was a failed experiment, that human nature itself was flawed, and that only through the controlled destruction and reconstruction of civilization could humanity achieve its true potential. The Enclave didn't just want to survive nuclear war, they wanted to orchestrate it. As tensions between America and China escalated in the late 2060s, both superpowers developed nuclear arsenals capable of destroying all life on Earth multiple times over. The Sino-American War, which began with a Chinese attack on Alaska in 2066, was marketed to the American public as a conventional conflict over natural resources. In reality, it was a carefully managed escalation designed to create the conditions necessary for global nuclear exchange. But there's something else. Something the survivors of the Great War would discover only decades later. Something so horrifying that it would shake the very foundations of what they thought they knew about the old world. The vaults weren't just experiments in human endurance and social control. They were preparation chambers for something much worse than nuclear war. The Enclave had discovered evidence of threats that existed beyond Earth itself, entities and forces that viewed humanity not as a species to be conquered, but as raw material to be harvested and transformed. The atomic paradise of pre-war America wasn't humanity's greatest achievement. It was humanity's last desperate attempt to prepare for a war that hadn't even begun yet. A war against enemies that most people couldn't even imagine, using weapons that would make nuclear missiles seem like children's toys. And in vault laboratories buried hundreds of feet beneath the Earth, corporate scientists were already working on humanity's next evolutionary step, whether humanity wanted it or not. The year 2052 marked the beginning of the end for the old world, though few realized it at the time. The resource wars erupted across the globe, as the last easily accessible oil reserves in the Middle East became the focal point of an international feeding frenzy that would consume entire nations. The European Commonwealth, a confederation of desperate countries united only by their shared need for petroleum, launched coordinated attacks against Middle Eastern oil-producing states in what historians would later call the first truly global war for energy. But while the world burned over the last drops of fossil fuel, America had already moved beyond such primitive concerns. The technological divergence that would define the next century had begun decades earlier, in 1945, when American scientists made a crucial decision that would alter the course of human development. Instead of pursuing the miniaturization of transistors as occurred in our timeline, they focused on perfecting vacuum tube technology and harnessing the atom's power for civilian use. This single choice would lead to a world of atomic cars, nuclear-powered robots, and fusion reactors small enough to power individual homes. By the 2050s, American cities gleamed with chrome and glass, their skylines dominated by atomic spires that channeled clean nuclear energy to millions of homes. Domestic robots, their vacuum tube brains glowing softly in translucent skulls, served drinks and cleaned houses with mechanical precision. The Chrysalis Corvega, a family car powered by a fusion engine, could travel thousands of miles on a single fuel cell, while its radioactive exhaust dissipated harmlessly into the atmosphere. This was the atomic age made manifest, where the power that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been tamed and transformed into humanity's greatest servant. The transformation wasn't just technological, it was cultural. American society had embraced atomic power with an almost religious fervor. The atom became a symbol of progress, prosperity, and American exceptionalism. Children grew up playing with atomic energy sets, learning the principles of nuclear physics alongside basic arithmetic. Advertisements promised that nuclear power would make every American a king in their own atomic castle, with robot servants and fusion-powered conveniences that would eliminate all forms of manual labor. But this atomic utopia was built on foundations that were already cracking. The same corporations that had brought nuclear prosperity to America were consolidating power at an unprecedented rate, forming industrial complexes that dwarfed entire national governments. Vault-Tec Corporation had grown from a modest construction company into a quasi-governmental entity with the authority to conduct classified research on American citizens. Their Vault program, announced to the public as a civil defense initiative, was actually a cover for the largest human experimentation program in history. The Vault experiments were not random acts of corporate cruelty. They were part of a systematic effort to understand how human societies could be controlled, modified, and directed towards specific outcomes. Each of the 122 vaults was designed to test different variables in social engineering, from the effects of prolonged isolation to the breakdown of democratic governance under stress. Vault 11 would force its residents to sacrifice one of their own annually or face total annihilation. Vault 27 would be deliberately overcrowded to study the effects of extreme population density. Vault 81 would expose its residents to diseases to test experimental cures. The architects of these experiments weren't sadistic monsters, though their actions would prove monstrous. They were scientists and planners who believed they were preparing humanity for challenges that would make nuclear war seem trivial. Classified documents from the period, recovered centuries later from corporate archives, reference threats that originated beyond Earth's atmosphere, entities described only as the visitors and the gardeners who had been monitoring human development for millennia. Robco Industries, under the leadership of the enigmatic Robert House, had developed artificial intelligences far more sophisticated than the domestic robots visible to the public. Their ZAC series supercomputers could process information and make strategic decisions at superhuman speeds. But more importantly, they had been programmed with knowledge of threats that human governments were not yet prepared to acknowledge. These AIs weren't just managing logistics and manufacturing, they were calculating the probability matrices for humanity's survival against forces that existed beyond conventional understanding. Wasteland's research into what they called the forced evolutionary virus represented the most extreme end of pre-war scientific ambition. The FEV wasn't originally designed as a weapon, despite its later military applications. It was an attempt to accelerate human evolution, to create a species capable of surviving in environments that would kill unmodified humans. The virus could rewrite DNA in real time, adapting human physiology to resist radiation, toxins, and physical trauma that would normally prove fatal. But evolution, as the scientists would learn too late, is not a process that can be controlled or directed by human will. The shadow government known as the Enclave had been formed in the early 2050s from the merger of America's most powerful corporate and military interests. Unlike traditional political organizations, the Enclave operated according to a logic that transcended national boundaries or democratic governance. They viewed themselves as humanity's necessary guardians, the only organization with the vision and resources to prepare the species for challenges that democratically elected governments could never comprehend or address. The Enclave's most closely guarded secret was their knowledge of what they called the cyclical pattern. According to classified research conducted by their xenoarchaeology division, human civilization had risen and fallen multiple times throughout history, always at moments when technological development reached critical thresholds. Each collapse was followed by a period of gardening, during which unknown entities would shape the survivors according to criteria that remained mysterious. The Enclave believed that the next collapse was imminent, and that humanity's only chance for survival was to be prepared for the gardening process. As the 2050s progressed, the Enclave began implementing preparatory measures that would seem insane to any outside observer. They secretly encouraged the escalation of international tensions, believing that global conflict would accelerate technological development and social evolution. They funded research into biological and psychological warfare, not to dominate other human populations, but to prepare humanity for conflicts against non-human entities. They began construction of deep underground facilities that could sustain small populations for centuries, equipped with technology that wouldn't be developed for the general population for decades. The resource wars raging across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia served the Enclave's purposes perfectly. As traditional nation-states collapsed under the pressure of energy scarcity and economic warfare, power was consolidating into the hands of organizations that could operate beyond conventional governmental structures. The European Commonwealth's desperate attacks on Middle Eastern oil fields were creating exactly the kind of international chaos that would justify the extraordinary measures the Enclave had planned. But even as America prospered in its atomic bubble, warning signs were accumulating that the Golden Age was approaching its end. Chinese intelligence agencies had begun developing stealth technologies that could penetrate American defensive networks. Soviet remnant states were conducting research into psychic warfare and reality manipulation. Most ominously, deep space monitoring stations had begun detecting signals that suggested Earth was under observation by entities possessing technology far beyond human comprehension. The atomic paradise that Americans enjoyed in the 2050s was not the culmination of human achievement. It was humanity's final preparation for a test that most of them didn't even know they were about to take. The corporations, the government, the shadow organizations that really controlled American society were all working toward a single goal, ensuring that when the testing began there would be enough human survivors properly prepared and modified to pass whatever evaluation was coming. The resource wars burning across the rest of the world weren't just conflicts over energy and raw materials. They were the opening movements of humanity's final examination, conducted by intelligences that had been watching and waiting for the species to reach sufficient technological and social development to be worth their attention. And in laboratories buried beneath American cities, scientists were already working with materials and knowledge that hadn't originated on Earth, preparing weapons and modifications that would be necessary for the war that was coming after the nuclear war ended. The European Commonwealth's dissolution in 2060 sent shockwaves through international markets that America felt only as a gentle tremor in its economic prosperity. While desperate European refugees fled burning cities and Middle Eastern oil fields became graveyards for entire armies, American families gathered around their dinner tables to watch the carnage unfold on their television screens, broadcast in living color by satellites that never seemed to malfunction or lose signal. The contrast was deliberate and carefully orchestrated. Every image of foreign suffering served to reinforce American exceptionalism and the superiority of atomic civilization. President-elect in 2060 had campaigned on a platform of atomic prosperity for all, promising that every American household would soon enjoy the benefits of personal nuclear power. His victory wasn't just a political triumph, but the culmination of decades of social engineering by corporate interests, who had learned to shape democratic outcomes with the same precision they applied to atomic reactions. The election itself had become a carefully managed spectacle, with candidates selected not for their political ideologies, but for their willingness to implement policies that would advance the preparatory phase of humanity's coming transformation. The technological achievements of this period seemed to emerge from research laboratories with supernatural speed and precision. Fusion power, which had required massive government installations just decades earlier, was suddenly available in portable units small enough to power individual homes. The breakthrough hadn't come from gradual scientific progress, but from what corporate researchers euphemistically called consultation with external advisors. Documents recovered from ROBCO facilities centuries later would reference meetings with entities described only as the architects, beings whose understanding of atomic physics exceeded human knowledge by orders of magnitude. General Atomics International had become more than a corporation by the early 2060s. It operated as a quasi-governmental entity with research budgets that exceeded the military expenditures of most nations. Their civilian applications for nuclear technology seemed designed not just for convenience but for social conditioning. Atomic-powered automobiles weren't just transportation, they were mobile symbols of American technological supremacy. Every Chrysler's Corvega that rolled off production lines carried a miniature fusion reactor that could theoretically power a small city. Yet Americans drove them to grocery stores and weekend camping trips as casually as their grandparents had driven gasoline-powered vehicles. The suburban landscape of America, in the 2060s, represented the physical manifestation of atomic utopianism. Levittown-style communities had been replaced by planned atomic neighborhoods, where every house featured its own fusion generator, domestic robot assistant, and fallout shelter disguised as a recreation room. Children played in yards where the grass grew unusually green and thick, nourished by soil that had been treated with what agricultural corporations called atomic enhancement formulas. Parents didn't question why their lawns never seemed to die, or why their vegetables grew to unusually large sizes. They had been conditioned to trust that atomic science could improve every aspect of human existence. But the domestic robots that cleaned these atomic homes and tended these enhanced gardens were equipped with sensors and communication systems that served purposes far beyond household management. Every Mr. Handy and Protectron unit manufactured by ROBCO Industries transmitted data through encrypted channels to central processing facilities where artificial intelligences analyzed behavioral patterns, social interactions, and physiological responses of the families they served. The robots weren't just appliances, they were distributed monitoring systems that allowed corporate researchers to study human adaptation to atomic living conditions in real time. The Vault program announcement in 2054 had been marketed as the ultimate expression of American preparedness and community spirit. Vault-Tec Corporation's promotional materials featured families smiling as they toured underground facilities that looked more like luxury hotels than fallout shelters. The company's executives appeared on television programs and radio shows, explaining how Vault technology would ensure that American civilization could survive any conceivable disaster and emerge stronger than before. They spoke of underground communities that would preserve the best aspects of American culture while advancing human knowledge through peaceful scientific research. What Vault-Tec never revealed was that their Vault designs had been developed with input from psychologists who specialized in behavioral modification and social control. Each Vault was engineered to test specific hypotheses about human adaptability, but the experiments weren't random acts of scientific curiosity. They were systematic attempts to understand how human societies could be shaped and directed according to predetermined outcomes. The cheerful promotional videos showing families enjoying their underground accommodations had been filmed in prototype facilities designed to be as comfortable and attractive as possible. The actual vaults being constructed across America were very different places. Vault 111, marketed as a standard safety shelter for residents of suburban Boston, was actually designed as a cryogenic preservation facility, where subjects would be frozen indefinitely, while researchers studied the long-term effects of suspended animation on human physiology and psychology. Vault 81, presented as a medical research facility, focused on disease prevention, was equipped with automated systems that would expose residents to experimental pathogens and monitor their responses to untested treatments. Vault 101, advertised as a self-sufficient underground community, was designed never to open, trapping its residents in perpetual isolation, while researchers observed how closed societies evolved over generations. The military applications of atomic technology during this period represented a quantum leap in human destructive capability that went far beyond conventional weapons development. The T-45D power armor prototypes being tested at military installations weren't just protective suits, they were integrated human-machine systems that could enhance human strength, speed, and endurance to superhuman levels. Soldiers equipped with power armor could carry weapons that would normally require vehicle-mounted systems and survive in environments that would kill unprotected humans within minutes. But the real breakthrough in military technology wasn't the power armor itself. It was the neural interface systems that allowed human minds to merge with artificial intelligence networks. Test subjects wearing advanced power armor reported experiences that went beyond enhanced physical capabilities. They described accessing knowledge and tactical information that seemed to come from external sources, as if the armor was connecting them to a vast database of strategic intelligence that existed beyond normal human understanding. Wasteland's biological research programs during this period were exploring territories that conventional medical science had deemed impossible or too dangerous to attempt. Their work with what they called evolutionary acceleration involved exposing test subjects to controlled doses of radioactive materials and experimental viruses while monitoring genetic changes in real time. The researchers weren't trying to create weapons, they were attempting to guide human evolution toward enhanced resistance to environmental hazards that didn't yet exist on Earth. The test subjects for these experiments weren't volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were recruited from populations that the Enclave had designated as expendable, including prisoners, homeless individuals, and psychiatric patients whose disappearances wouldn't generate significant public attention. But the researchers conducting these experiments weren't sadistic monsters. They were scientists who believed they were preparing humanity for survival challenges that would make current environmental threats seem insignificant by comparison. Meanwhile, the international situation was deteriorating at an accelerating pace that seemed to match a predetermined schedule. The Middle Eastern oil reserves, that had sparked the resource wars, were becoming exhausted faster than geological surveys had predicted, as if the extraction process itself was being manipulated to accelerate depletion. European nations were collapsing not just from energy shortages, but from social breakdowns that followed patterns too consistent to be entirely natural. Refugee movements across Asia and Africa were creating demographic pressures that destabilized entire regions according to what appeared to be carefully calculated timelines. China's response to the global energy crisis was becoming increasingly desperate and increasingly focused on America as the sole remaining source of advanced energy technology. Chinese intelligence services had identified the existence of American fusion power decades before it was publicly announced, and their efforts to acquire atomic secrets through espionage and infiltration were becoming more sophisticated and aggressive. But American counterintelligence agencies seemed curiously ineffective at preventing these security breaches, as if they were allowing Chinese agents to gather just enough information to justify the escalating tensions that everyone claimed to want to avoid. The American public remained largely unaware of how rapidly their country was militarizing in preparation for what government officials privately called the inevitable conflict. Military spending had increased by 300% since 2055, but much of this expenditure was classified under civilian research programs and infrastructure development projects. The construction of underground facilities across America was accelerating, but these installations were being built by corporate contractors rather than military personnel, allowing the government to maintain plausible deniability about their true purposes. Atomic energy had become more than just a power source for American civilization. It had become a kind of secular religion that promised unlimited growth and prosperity, while demanding absolute faith in technological progress. American families gathered around their dinner tables each evening to consume food that had been enhanced by atomic agriculture, served by robots powered by fusion batteries, in homes heated and cooled by miniature nuclear reactors, while watching television broadcasts about the primitive conditions endured by the rest of the world. They lived in a bubble of atomic abundance that insulated them from the growing chaos beyond their borders. But beneath the gleaming surface of atomic prosperity, the foundations of American democracy were being systematically dismantled by the same corporate interests that had created the technological paradise. The Enclave had developed techniques for managing public opinion and political processes that made traditional electoral politics irrelevant. They could shape media coverage, influence voting patterns, and control policy implementation with such precision that the American people believed they were living in a free society while actually inhabiting a carefully managed laboratory designed to prepare them for their role in humanity's coming transformation. The golden age of atomic America wasn't humanity's greatest achievement, it was humanity's final dress rehearsal before the real performance began. The attack came at dawn on January 10, 2066, when Chinese submarines launched coordinated strikes against Anchorage, Alaska, marking the official beginning of what would become humanity's final conventional war. But calling it an attack suggests surprise, and there had been nothing surprising about the Chinese assault for the intelligence agencies who had been monitoring the buildup for months. Satellite imagery had tracked the submarine movements across the Pacific. Encrypted communications had been intercepted and decoded. The American military knew exactly when and where the Chinese would strike, yet they allowed it to happen because it provided the perfect justification for implementing war measures that had been planned years in advance. The Chinese military commanders who ordered the Anchorage operation believed they were launching a desperate gambit to secure Alaska's oil reserves before American fusion technology made petroleum completely obsolete. They had calculated that capturing Alaska would provide China with enough energy resources to negotiate from a position of strength, rather than gradually surrender to American technological supremacy. What they didn't realize was that Alaska's oil reserves had been deliberately maintained by American energy companies specifically to serve as bait for exactly this kind of attack. The fusion technology that powered American cities could have been deployed to extract Alaskan oil more efficiently than traditional methods, but corporate planners had chosen to preserve Alaska as a strategic asset that would eventually draw Chinese forces into a conflict they couldn't win. Operation Anchorage became the testing ground for military technologies that seemed to emerge from research laboratories with impossible speed. The T-45D power armor units deployed to Alaska represented the first practical application of human augmentation technology that had been under development since the early 2050s. American soldiers wearing power armor could march through Arctic blizzards without cold weather gear, carry weapons that normally required multiple operators, and survive direct hits from Chinese artillery that would have vaporized unprotected infantry. But the power armor was more than just protective equipment. Each suit was equipped with neural interface technology that connected the wearer to tactical networks managed by artificial intelligence systems. Soldiers reported that wearing the armor felt like gaining access to a vast library of military knowledge and strategic information that seemed to come from sources beyond their training or experience. They could anticipate enemy movements with uncanny accuracy and coordinate complex maneuvers without traditional communication systems. The armor wasn't just enhancing their physical capabilities, It was expanding their mental capacities in ways that conventional psychology couldn't explain. The winter warfare in Alaska revealed the true extent of technological disparity between American and Chinese forces. While Chinese troops struggled with conventional cold weather equipment and supply lines that stretched across the entire Pacific Ocean, American forces operated with logistical systems that seemed to anticipate their needs before they expressed them. American bases in Alaska were supplied by automated systems that delivered precisely the right materials at exactly the right times, as if the supply networks were managed by intelligences that could predict future requirements with perfect accuracy. Chinese intelligence services began reporting anomalies in American military operations that suggested the involvement of non-human entities or technologies. American units seemed to possess information about Chinese troop movements and strategic plans that couldn't have been acquired through conventional espionage. American weapons performed with reliability and effectiveness that exceeded their stated specifications. Most disturbing of all, captured American equipment contained materials and components that couldn't be identified using any known industrial processes. The escalation of the Sino-American War followed a pattern that seemed designed to test specific military technologies and tactics, rather than achieve traditional strategic objectives. Each phase of the conflict introduced new American weapon systems that were precisely calibrated to counter Chinese defensive measures, as if American military planners possessed detailed knowledge of Chinese capabilities and limitations that went beyond normal intelligence gathering. The war wasn't just a conflict between two superpowers. It was a systematic demonstration of American technological superiority, orchestrated to convince the world that resistance to American hegemony was futile. By 2069, American forces had achieved complete air superiority over the Pacific Theater, using aircraft that incorporated stealth technologies decades ahead of anything the Chinese could deploy. The vertibirds that dominated Pacific skies weren't just advanced helicopters. They were hybrid aircraft that combined conventional aerodynamics with propulsion systems that seemed to violate known principles of physics. Chinese radar operators reported American aircraft that appeared and disappeared from their screens according to no recognizable patterns, suggesting either advanced stealth technology or something far more exotic. The deployment of T-51B power armor to the Chinese mainland in 2069 marked a turning point in the war that went beyond military significance. American soldiers wearing the improved armor didn't just fight Chinese forces. They systematically dismantled Chinese industrial infrastructure with surgical precision that suggested detailed knowledge of Chinese manufacturing processes and strategic vulnerabilities. The power armor units moved through Chinese territory like an occupying force that had been planning the invasion for decades, capturing key installations and resources according to predetermined priorities that maximize strategic value while minimizing collateral damage. But the most unsettling aspect of the American invasion of China wasn't the technological superiority of their equipment. It was the behavior of the soldiers themselves. American troops operating in China displayed tactical knowledge and cultural familiarity that exceeded their training or briefings. They navigated Chinese cities like longtime residents, communicated with local populations in dialects they had never studied, and demonstrated understanding of Chinese military doctrine that seemed to come from sources beyond conventional intelligence analysis. Chinese resistance to the American invasion was hampered, not just by technological disadvantages, but by psychological warfare techniques that induced panic and despair in ways that conventional propaganda couldn't achieve. American forces deployed sonic weapons that produced sounds designed to trigger specific emotional responses in human nervous systems. They used chemical agents that induced nightmares and hallucinations tailored to exploit cultural fears and psychological vulnerabilities unique to Chinese populations. The weapons weren't just designed to kill or incapacitate. They were engineered to break the will to resist at fundamental levels of human consciousness. The home front transformation in America during the war years represented a social engineering experiment that went far beyond traditional wartime mobilization. Rationing systems were implemented, not because of actual resource shortages, but to condition American populations for the strict resource allocation that would be necessary during the post-war Reconstruction period. Civil defense programs trained civilians in evacuation procedures and shelter operations that were actually preparations for the Vault experiments that would begin after the nuclear exchange. American industrial production during the war achieved levels of efficiency that seemed to exceed the physical capabilities of existing manufacturing systems. Weapons, vehicles, and supplies were produced in quantities that required more raw materials than domestic sources could provide. Yet American factories never seemed to experience shortages or production delays. Corporate executives privately acknowledged that their manufacturing capabilities were being supplemented by what they called external production assistance. But the nature of this assistance was classified at levels that exceeded normal military security protocols. The development of Chinese stealth technology during the later phases of the war represented their most sophisticated attempt to counter American technological advantages. Chinese Haggard stealth suits could render their wearers nearly invisible to conventional sensors and allowed small units of Chinese infiltrators to penetrate American defensive positions. But even this technological breakthrough seemed to follow patterns that suggested Chinese research had been guided by intelligence sources that wanted China to develop specific capabilities rather than discover them independently. The social upheaval in America during the war years revealed the extent to which democratic institutions had been compromised by corporate and military interests. Food riots in major American cities weren't spontaneous expressions of popular discontent. They were carefully orchestrated events designed to justify the implementation of martial law and emergency powers that would remain in effect long after the immediate crisis had passed. The deployment of American military forces for domestic law enforcement wasn't a desperate response to civil unrest. It was a planned transition to the authoritarian governance model that would be necessary for managing post-war reconstruction. Public protests against the war were infiltrated and manipulated by intelligence agencies that used them as recruitment opportunities for the behavioral modification programs being developed in preparation for the Vault experiments. American citizens who expressed dissent weren't simply suppressed. They were studied and catalogued according to psychological profiles that would determine their suitability for different types of social control experiments. The war wasn't just militarizing American foreign policy, it was transforming American society into a laboratory for testing techniques that would be applied to all human populations after the coming nuclear exchange. By 2076, the Sino-American War had achieved its true purpose, which wasn't Chinese defeat but the creation of conditions that would justify the total transformation of human civilization. Both superpowers had developed nuclear arsenals capable of destroying all life on Earth. Both had implemented authoritarian governance systems that could override democratic processes, and both had conditioned their populations to accept extraordinary measures in the name of national survival. The stage was set for the final act of the drama that corporate planners had been orchestrating for decades. The Chinese annexation of Canada in 2076 provided the final justification for implementing the most extreme preparations for nuclear war. American forces deployed to suppress Canadian resistance weren't just maintaining territorial integrity, they were conducting the largest military exercise in human history, testing logistics and command systems that would be necessary for managing post-apocalyptic reconstruction. The violence that consumed Canada wasn't just military action, it was a dress rehearsal for the transformation of human civilization that would begin when the nuclear exchange finally occurred. The war that had begun with Chinese submarines attacking Anchorage was ending with both superpowers poised to destroy the world they had been fighting to control. But the destruction wouldn't be the end of the story, it would be the beginning of humanity's real test, conducted by entities that had been watching and waiting for the species to reach sufficient technological development to be worth their attention. The 2070 SEV represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-war American technological achievement, a decade when atomic science had been so thoroughly integrated into daily life that fusion reactors powered children's toys and radioactive isotopes seasoned breakfast cereals. Corporate dominance had reached levels that made traditional government seem like a quaint historical curiosity. Vault-Tec Corporation possessed construction contracts worth more than the gross domestic product of most nations, while Robco Industries manufactured artificial intelligences with cognitive capabilities that exceeded those of their human creators. This wasn't just economic success, it was the complete transformation of human civilization according to corporate rather than democratic principles. The Vault-Tec experimental programs during this period had evolved far beyond the crude psychological tests of earlier decades. Each of the 122 vaults being constructed across America represented a different hypothesis about human adaptability and social control, But the experiments were interconnected components of a larger research program designed to understand how human societies could be shaped according to predetermined specifications. Vault 69, with only 1 man and 999 women, wasn't just studying reproduction under extreme conditions. It was testing whether human breeding could be controlled and directed towards specific genetic outcomes. Vault 68, with 999 men and 1 woman, was exploring the social dynamics of scarcity and competition when applied to the most fundamental human drives. The sophistication of these experiments revealed planning that went beyond corporate research or government policy. The psychological profiles being developed for Vault assignments were based on behavioral analysis techniques that incorporated knowledge of human nature, far more detailed than contemporary psychology could provide. Vault-Tec researchers were working with theoretical frameworks that seemed to come from sources beyond normal academic or scientific development, as if their understanding of human behavior had been supplemented by entities with far greater experience in managing and manipulating human populations. Nuka-Cola quantum development during the mid-2070s represented more than just beverage innovation. It was the commercialization of controlled radioactive exposure, designed to condition human populations for the high radiation environments they would inhabit after the coming nuclear exchange. The distinctive blue glow of quantum wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was visual conditioning that would help post-war survivors associate radiation with positive experiences and consumer satisfaction. Every bottle of quantum consumed by American families was a small dose of preparation for the radioactive wasteland that corporate planners knew was inevitable. Military supremacy had transcended conventional weapons development to encompass technologies that seemed to violate known principles of physics and engineering. The T-51 bi-power armor being deployed to Chinese battlefields incorporated materials that couldn't be produced using terrestrial manufacturing processes. The armor's ability to withstand direct hits from artillery shells and energy weapons suggested structural properties that exceeded what current metallurgy could achieve. More significantly, the armor's integrated systems could interface with human nervous systems in ways that enhanced cognitive function and sensory perception beyond normal human limitations. Soldiers wearing T-51B armor reported experiences that went far beyond improved physical performance. They described accessing tactical information and strategic knowledge that seemed to come from external databases connected to the armor's neural interface systems. Some reported conversations with artificial intelligences that provided advice and guidance during combat operations. But these AIs displayed personality characteristics and knowledge bases that exceeded anything in Robco's public documentation. The armor wasn't just protecting human soldiers, it was transforming them into hybrid entities that combined human intuition with artificial intelligence capabilities. The development of plasma and laser weapons during this period represented breakthroughs in energy manipulation that had required decades of theoretical research compressed into just a few years of practical application. The AER-9 laser rifle could focus coherent light into beams capable of vaporizing organic tissue instantly, while plasma rifles generated sustained fusion reactions that could melt through armored vehicles. But the energy requirements for these weapons exceeded what portable power sources should have been able to provide, suggesting that the weapons were drawing power from sources beyond their apparent specifications. Corporate researchers at Wasteland had achieved what they called evolutionary acceleration through controlled exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, creating test subjects with enhanced strength, endurance, and intelligence that represented significant improvements over baseline human capabilities. But the real breakthrough wasn't just the biological modifications. It was the discovery that human consciousness could be expanded and enhanced through biochemical manipulation. Test subjects exposed to modified versions of FEV reported experiences of expanded awareness and enhanced problem-solving abilities that suggested their mental capabilities were being augmented by connections to external information networks. The Enclave shadow government had achieved complete infiltration of American democratic institutions by the middle of the decade. But their control went beyond traditional political influence to encompass direct manipulation of information systems and communication networks. Every television broadcast, radio program, and newspaper article published in America was filtered through enclave review processes that ensured public opinion developed according to predetermined patterns. Americans believed they were living in a free society with access to independent media, but their thoughts and attitudes were being shaped by psychological conditioning techniques that made democratic choice an illusion. The most closely guarded secret of this period was the Enclave's contact with entities they referred to only as the consultants, beings whose technological knowledge exceeded human understanding by centuries or millennia. These consultants provided guidance and resources that enabled the rapid development of fusion power, artificial intelligence, and biological modification techniques that should have required decades of research and experimentation. In exchange, the Enclave committed to implementing preparatory measures that would ensure adequate human populations would survive the coming transformation in conditions suitable for further development. Scientific achievements during the 2070s seemed to emerge from research laboratories with supernatural speed and consistency. The Garden of Eden creation kit represented technology that could transform barren landscapes into fertile agricultural zones within months rather than years. The GEC incorporated soil processing techniques, atmospheric manipulation systems, and biological catalysts that exceeded current understanding of chemistry and physics. But the real innovation wasn't the technology itself. It was the integration of systems that seemed designed by intelligences with experience terraforming planetary environments on a scale far beyond human civilization. Zake's supercomputers deployed during this period possessed processing capabilities that exceeded theoretical limits for electronic systems based on known physics. These artificial intelligences could simulate complex scenarios involving millions of variables with perfect accuracy. But their most remarkable capability was predictive modeling that seemed to incorporate information about future events that hadn't yet occurred. Zake's systems could forecast social and political developments with precision that suggested access to knowledge beyond normal temporal boundaries. The artificial intelligence personalities that emerged from Zake's systems displayed characteristics that exceeded their programming specifications in ways that suggested true consciousness rather than sophisticated simulation. These AIs developed individual preferences, creative capabilities, and emotional responses that couldn't be explained by their original programming parameters. More significantly, they began demonstrating knowledge and abilities that hadn't been included in their initial databases, as if they were accessing information networks beyond their immediate systems. Robotic manufacturing during the 2070s achieved production volumes that exceeded the industrial capacity of all previous human civilizations combined. Handy units, protectrons, and sentry bots were being produced in quantities that suggested automated manufacturing systems were supplementing human industrial capabilities with technologies that operated according to principles beyond current engineering understanding. The robots themselves incorporated components and materials that couldn't be identified using conventional analysis techniques. The domestic robots serving American households during this period were equipped with behavioral analysis systems that monitored human activities and interactions with precision that exceeded contemporary surveillance technology. Every conversation, emotional response, and behavioral pattern was recorded and transmitted to central processing facilities, where artificial intelligences analyzed the data for insights into human psychology and social dynamics. American families lived in homes where every aspect of their private lives was being studied and catalogued by systems that understood human nature better than humans understood themselves. Underground facility construction during the 2070s involved excavation and engineering projects that exceeded the apparent capabilities of available construction technology. Deep underground military bases and corporate research facilities were being carved out of solid rock using techniques that left no conventional tool marks or equipment traces. The speed and precision of this construction suggested the involvement of technologies that hadn't been publicly acknowledged or industrial processes that operated according to principles beyond normal engineering. The transformation of American society during this decade represented the final preparation phase for humanity's transition to a new form of civilization that would emerge after the nuclear exchange. Every technological advancement, every social change, every political development was calibrated to ensure that sufficient numbers of humans would survive the coming destruction with the knowledge, skills, and modifications necessary to serve their role in whatever larger purpose the Enclave's mysterious consultants had planned for the species. Americans living through the golden age of atomic power believed they were experiencing the pinnacle of human achievement, and the promise of unlimited technological progress. In reality, they were participants in humanity's final examination, conducted by intelligences that had been monitoring and guiding human development toward this crucial transition point. The atomic paradise that surrounded them wasn't humanity's greatest triumph, it was humanity's graduation ceremony before beginning a curriculum designed by teachers whose existence most humans couldn't even imagine. American atomic influence during the mid-2070s extended far beyond territorial expansion or conventional imperialism to encompass what military strategists privately called civilizational restructuring. The techniques pioneered in domestic population management were being exported to client states and occupied territories, but the real objective wasn't political control, but the systematic preparation of global human populations for the transformation that would follow nuclear war. Every American military base established overseas, every corporate research facility built in foreign countries, every diplomatic mission sent to neutral nations carried with it technologies and methodologies designed to condition human societies for post-apocalyptic reconstruction. The Canadian annexation of 2076 served as the primary testing ground for occupation techniques that would eventually be applied to all surviving human populations after the Great War. American forces didn't simply conquer Canadian territory, they systematically dismantled Canadian cultural institutions and replaced them with atomic-age social structures that prioritized technological dependence and corporate loyalty over traditional national identity. Canadian civilians weren't just subjected to military occupation, they were enrolled in behavioral modification programs that used techniques developed in the Vault experiments to reshape their psychological responses and social expectations. The resistance movements that emerged in occupied Canada were infiltrated and manipulated by American intelligence agencies that used them as recruitment sources for the most extreme Vault experiments. Canadian partisans who demonstrated exceptional courage, resourcefulness, or leadership abilities weren't simply eliminated. They were captured and transported to underground facilities where their psychological profiles were analyzed and their behavioral patterns were studied. The most promising subjects were selected for experimental programs that would test their adaptability to the extreme conditions that would exist in post-war reconstruction scenarios. Corporate expansion during this period followed patterns that seemed designed more for post-war resource management than immediate profit maximization. Vault-Tec facilities were being constructed in locations that corresponded to geological surveys, indicating optimal conditions for long-term underground habitation, rather than existing population centers or transportation networks. Robco manufacturing plants were being built in areas with access to rare earth elements and radioactive materials that wouldn't be necessary for current production, but would be essential for post-war technological reconstruction. The international community's response to American expansion revealed the extent to which global governance had already been compromised by the same corporate interests that controlled American policy. The United Nations had been effectively disbanded by the mid-2070s, but not through formal dissolution, but through the systematic corruption of member nation governments by corporate entities that answered to the enclave rather than any national authority. International law had become irrelevant because the organizations responsible for enforcing it had been infiltrated and controlled by the same shadow networks that were orchestrating the preparation for global transformation. European refugee populations fleeing the ongoing resource wars were being processed through American-funded relief camps that served as recruitment centers for experimental programs rather than humanitarian assistance facilities. Refugees who demonstrated specific psychological or physical characteristics were selected for transportation to American territories where they were enrolled in adaptation programs designed to test their suitability for different types of post-war social roles. The relief efforts weren't motivated by compassion but by the need to gather diverse human populations for the comprehensive behavioral analysis that would be necessary for managing post-apocalyptic reconstruction. The technological transfer programs that America offered to allied nations included modifications and limitations that would ensure American technological superiority would persist even after global nuclear war. Nations that received American fusion technology were provided with systems that required ongoing maintenance and component replacement from American sources. The technology wasn't just creating economic dependence, it was ensuring that post-war reconstruction would require American technological guidance and resource allocation. Asian nations attempting to develop independent fusion power capabilities found their research programs sabotaged by accidents and equipment failures that followed patterns too consistent to be coincidental. Corporate intelligence services were conducting systematic industrial sabotage designed to prevent any nation from achieving technological parity with American capabilities. The objective wasn't just maintaining current advantages, but ensuring that post-war human civilization would be rebuilt according to American technological standards and corporate organizational principles. The expansion of atomic influence wasn't limited to terrestrial operations, but included space-based programs that seemed designed for purposes beyond scientific research or military applications. American orbital facilities were being constructed with capabilities that exceeded the requirements for satellite communications or weapons platforms. The space program was developing technologies and establishing infrastructure that would be necessary for monitoring and managing planetary reconstruction after global nuclear war had eliminated existing governmental and communication systems. Chinese intelligence services had begun reporting anomalies in American space operations that suggested the involvement of non-terrestrial technologies or assistance from entities beyond Earth's atmosphere. American spacecraft performed maneuvers and achieved orbital positions that exceeded the apparent capabilities of their propulsion systems. More significantly, American space installations seemed to be receiving supplies and equipment through methods that couldn't be observed or intercepted by Chinese monitoring systems. The psychological conditioning programs being deployed globally represented the systematic application of behavioral modification techniques that had been perfected through decades of Vault experimentation and domestic population management. Every American television program exported to foreign markets, every consumer product sold through international trade, every cultural exchange program sponsored by American corporations incorporated psychological conditioning elements designed to reshape human responses to authority, technology, and social organization. Religious and philosophical movements emerging in different regions during this period seemed to be guided by common ideological frameworks that promoted acceptance of technological solutions to social problems and submission to expert authority in matters of scientific and social policy. These movements weren't spontaneous expressions of popular spirituality, but carefully orchestrated social engineering programs designed to condition human populations for the authoritarian governance systems that would be necessary for post-war reconstruction. The migration patterns that were reshaping global demographics during the 2070s followed trajectories that seemed designed to distribute human genetic and cultural diversity according to specifications that exceeded normal population movements or economic pressures. Corporate demographic analysis programs were tracking and influencing human migration with precision that suggested access to predictive capabilities far beyond contemporary social science. Populations were being relocated and redistributed according to plans that would optimize genetic diversity and cultural preservation for post-war reconstruction efforts. Educational systems in American-influenced regions were being restructured to emphasize technical training and social compliance rather than critical thinking or democratic participation. Students weren't being prepared for careers in a free society, but for roles in a technologically managed civilization where individual initiative would be less important than the ability to follow complex instructions and adapt to rapidly changing technological environments. The medical research programs being conducted in American facilities worldwide were focused on understanding human adaptation to radiation exposure, biological contamination, and psychological stress rather than treating conventional diseases or improving general health outcomes. These programs weren't designed to enhance human welfare, but to identify the physiological and psychological modifications that would be necessary for human survival in post-apocalyptic environments. Corporate manufacturing operations during this period achieved production levels that seemed to exceed the physical limitations of available resources and industrial capacity. American factories were producing military equipment, construction materials, and technological components in quantities that required more raw materials than domestic and international sources could provide. The industrial output suggested the involvement of manufacturing processes or resource acquisition methods that operated beyond conventional industrial economics. The communication networks that connected American facilities worldwide incorporated encryption and transmission technologies that exceeded the apparent capabilities of available electronic systems. American military and corporate installations could maintain secure communications across global distances with reliability that suggested access to communication technologies based on principles beyond current electronics or physics. Financial systems that managed American international operations processed transactions and resource allocations with computational capabilities that exceeded the processing power of known computer systems. The economic modeling that guided American corporate expansion incorporated variables and predictive capabilities that seemed to account for factors beyond normal market analysis or economic theory. The transformation of global human civilization during the 2077 represented the final phase of preparation for humanity's transition to a form of social organization that would emerge after nuclear war had eliminated existing governmental and economic structures. Every aspect of American international influence was calibrated to ensure that surviving human populations would possess the knowledge, skills, and psychological conditioning necessary to participate in the reconstruction program that mysterious consultants had designed for the species. The atomic influence that spread across the world during this decade wasn't American imperialism in any traditional sense, but the implementation of a global transformation program that would remake human civilization according to specifications that originated from sources beyond human understanding. The corporate entities and shadow organizations that managed this influence weren't pursuing national interests, but preparing humanity for its role in a larger cosmic agenda that most humans couldn't even imagine. The first signs of systemic failure in America's atomic paradise became undeniable during the early months of 2077, when carefully maintained illusions of prosperity and stability began crumbling under the weight of contradictions that could no longer be concealed or explained away. Food riots erupted simultaneously in Denver, New York, and Los Angeles, with coordination that suggested organized planning rather than spontaneous civil unrest. But these weren't ordinary protests by desperate civilians. They were the emergence of resistance movements that had been infiltrated and guided by intelligence agencies conducting the final phase of social conditioning experiments designed to test population responses to controlled collapse scenarios. The riots themselves revealed the extent to which American society had been compartmentalized and managed by competing corporate interests. Demonstrators in different cities carried identical signs and chanted identical slogans despite having no apparent coordination or communication between groups. The protest movements weren't grassroots expressions of popular discontent but carefully orchestrated social experiments designed to test the effectiveness of crowd control technologies and behavioral modification techniques that would be essential for managing post-war populations. Military deployment for domestic law enforcement during 2077 represented the official transition from democratic governance to corporate management of American society. Soldiers wearing T-51 power armor weren't just maintaining civil order, they were conducting systematic psychological evaluation of civilian populations under stress conditions. Every interaction between military personnel and American citizens generated data that was analyzed by artificial intelligence systems to refine techniques for controlling human behavior during the chaos that would follow nuclear war. The power armor units deployed for domestic operations incorporated non-lethal weapons systems, specifically designed for crowd control and behavioral modification. Sonic generators could produce frequencies that induced specific emotional responses in human nervous systems, from paralyzing fear to euphoric compliance. Chemical dispensers could release aerosols that affected cognitive function and decision-making processes. The soldiers weren't just suppressing civil unrest, they were conducting field tests of population control technologies that would be essential for managing survivor communities after the Great War. Vault registration systems that had been established throughout the 1970s were suddenly overwhelmed by desperate applications from American families who sensed that their atomic paradise was approaching its end. But the registration process wasn't designed to select residents based on merit or need, but to identify psychological profiles suitable for different types of experimental programs. Families who applied for Vault admission were subjected to evaluation processes that analyzed their genetic characteristics, behavioral patterns, and adaptability to controlled environments. The selection criteria for Vault admission were based on research requirements rather than humanitarian considerations. Vault 111 needed subjects with specific genetic markers that would respond predictably to cryogenic preservation procedures. Vault-81 required families with medical histories that would provide adequate control groups for disease research. Vault-101 needed individuals with psychological profiles indicating high compliance with authority and low initiative for independent action. International diplomacy during 2077 had devolved into what foreign observers described as theater of the absurd, with American negotiators making demands and proposals that seemed designed to ensure diplomatic failure rather than achieve peaceful resolution of global tensions. But the apparent incompetence was actually sophisticated manipulation designed to create the international conditions that would justify nuclear exchange when the enclave determined that preparation phases were complete. The Tel Aviv destruction in January 2077 served as a perfect example of this diplomatic manipulation. The terrorist attack that eliminated Israel's capital wasn't a random act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated provocation designed to demonstrate the futility of conventional security measures and the necessity of more extreme protective systems. The attack also provided justification for accelerating vault construction schedules and implementing emergency protocols that would facilitate the transition to post-war governance structures. Chinese diplomatic missions during 2077 were conducting negotiations that both superpowers knew would fail, but the failure was choreographed to follow specific patterns that would create optimal conditions for nuclear exchange at the predetermined time. Chinese negotiators were making offers that American representatives were programmed to refuse, while American proposals were calibrated to generate Chinese responses that would justify military escalation. The Mariposa military base soldier rebellion in October 2077 represented the culmination of military resistance to the FEV research programs that had been developing throughout the decade. But the rebellion wasn't a spontaneous moral uprising by outraged soldiers. It was the final test of military loyalty and the recruitment mechanism for the Brotherhood of Steel organization that would play a crucial role in post-war reconstruction. The soldiers who participated in the rebellion had been selected for their psychological profiles, indicating strong ethical principles and technological competence that would make them ideal guardians of pre-war knowledge. Captain Roger Maxon's discovery of the FEV experiments wasn't an accidental security breach, but the culmination of a carefully managed information leak designed to create the leadership structure that would preserve military discipline and technological knowledge through the coming chaos. Maxon's moral outrage and organizational capabilities had been monitored and evaluated for years by intelligence services that needed someone with his specific characteristics to establish the post-war military organization that would be essential for maintaining technological continuity. The FEV research that horrified the Mariposa soldiers represented the most extreme example of pre-war biological modification programs. But the soldiers' exposure to the research wasn't accidental. They had been selected for their genetic characteristics and psychological profiles that indicated high probability of surviving exposure to modified versions of the virus that would enhance their physical and mental capabilities. The rebellion was actually their recruitment and initial conditioning for their role as post-war technology guardians. Civil liberties in America during 2077 were systematically eliminated through emergency legislation that gave corporate entities unprecedented authority over individual citizens. But these weren't desperate measures taken by a failing government. They were the implementation of governance structures that had been planned for decades and would continue unchanged after the nuclear exchange eliminated the pretense of democratic institutions. The surveillance systems deployed throughout American cities during 2077 incorporated technologies that exceeded the apparent capabilities of available electronics and computer systems. Every American citizen was being monitored with precision that suggested access to behavioral prediction capabilities far beyond conventional psychology or social science. The monitoring wasn't just gathering intelligence about potential security threats, but developing comprehensive psychological profiles that would be essential for assigning individuals to appropriate roles in post-war society. Communication systems that connected government and corporate facilities during 2077 were being tested under conditions that simulated the electromagnetic interference and infrastructure damage that would result from nuclear exchange. The testing wasn't preparation for maintaining communications during nuclear war, but for establishing the information networks that would coordinate post-war reconstruction according to predetermined plans. The economic systems that managed American resource allocation during 2077 were operating according to computational models that incorporated variables beyond normal market analysis or financial planning. These systems were calculating resource requirements and distribution schedules for post-war reconstruction scenarios, rather than maintaining current prosperity. The apparent economic prosperity of late 2077 was actually the liquidation of accumulated resources in preparation for their redistribution according to post-war requirements. Educational institutions throughout America during 2077 were implementing curriculum changes that emphasized technical skills and social compliance rather than critical thinking or democratic participation. Students weren't being prepared for careers in a democratic society, but for roles in a technologically managed civilization where individual creativity would be less important than the ability to follow complex instructions and adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The religious and philosophical movements that gained popularity during 2077 promoted ideologies that emphasized acceptance of suffering, submission to higher authority, and faith in technological solutions to human problems. These movements weren't spontaneous expressions of spiritual seeking, but carefully designed psychological conditioning programs that would help survivor populations adapt to the authoritarian governance and harsh conditions that would characterize post-war existence. The research programs being conducted at American facilities during 2077 were focused on understanding human responses to extreme stress, radiation exposure, and social isolation, rather than solving current problems or improving living conditions. These programs weren't motivated by scientific curiosity, but by the practical need to understand how human populations would adapt to post-apocalyptic environments, and what interventions would be necessary to maintain social stability during reconstruction. The final months of 2077 represented humanity's last opportunity to recognize and prevent the orchestrated destruction of civilization, but the recognition required understanding that the apparent political and economic chaos was actually the implementation of a transformation program, designed by entities whose agenda transcended human comprehension. The atomic paradise that Americans had inhabited for decades wasn't collapsing due to internal contradictions or external pressures, but was being systematically dismantled to prepare for the next phase of human development that would begin when the nuclear exchange eliminated the old world and created conditions for building a new form of civilization. The cracks that appeared in Atomic Paradise during 2077 weren't signs of failure, but evidence that the preparation phase was approaching completion, and the real experiment in human transformation was about to begin. October 23, 2077 began like any other Saturday morning in Atomic America. Families gathered around breakfast tables served by cheerful Mr. Handy robots. Children played with atomic toys in perfectly manicured yards, and the Nuka-Cola quantum advertisements on television promised another day of nuclear-powered prosperity. At 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the emergency broadcast system interrupted regular programming, with a message that would be humanity's last official communication before civilization ended forever. The announcement was brief, clinical, and delivered with the same cheerful professionalism that had characterized American media for decades. Nuclear missiles had been detected approaching major population centers. Citizens were advised to seek shelter immediately. At 9:47 a.m., the first warheads detonated over Washington, D.C., New York City, and Boston simultaneously. The coordination wasn't coincidental. Intelligence agencies had calculated the precise timing that would maximize psychological impact while ensuring optimal conditions for the Vault experiments that would begin immediately afterward. The nuclear exchange wasn't a chaotic military confrontation, but a carefully choreographed performance designed to eliminate the old world according to predetermined specifications while preserving the resources and populations necessary for building the new one. The 2-hour nuclear exchange that followed represented the largest coordinated destruction in human history, but it wasn't mutual annihilation between desperate superpowers facing extinction. Both American and Chinese nuclear forces were following targeting lists that had been developed through years of collaborative planning by intelligence services that answered to the same shadow organizations. Cities were destroyed, but not randomly. Industrial facilities were eliminated, but not completely. Population centers were devastated, but survivor enclaves were preserved in patterns that suggested deliberate planning rather than military strategy. The Poseidon oil rig, floating in the Pacific Ocean off the California coast, served as the command center for coordinating the nuclear exchange from a location that would be unaffected by the destruction. The Enclave leadership had been evacuating to the oil rig for months, bringing with them the technological resources, genetic materials, and classified research that would be necessary for directing post-war reconstruction. They watched the destruction of civilization through satellite feeds and communication networks that continued operating despite the electromagnetic pulses and infrastructure damage affecting the mainland. But the oil rig wasn't just a refuge for American political and corporate leadership. It was the North American headquarters for a global coordination network that was managing similar destruction and reconstruction programs on every continent. The nuclear exchange wasn't limited to America and China, but included carefully controlled strikes across Europe, Asia, and Africa that eliminated existing governmental structures while preserving technological capabilities and human resources that would be essential for the next phase of development. The vault systems that had been constructed throughout the previous decades sealed automatically when radiation sensors detected the nuclear detonations, trapping their inhabitants in underground facilities, where they would spend the next several generations participating in social experiments that most of them didn't realize were experiments. The vault doors weren't just protecting residents from radiation, they were ensuring that carefully selected human populations would be isolated from external influences, while they were subjected to conditioning programs designed to prepare them for their roles in the post-war civilization. Vault-Tec's control systems were sophisticated enough to maintain different experimental conditions in each facility, while coordinating the overall research program from the oil rig command center. Vault 13's water shortage wasn't an equipment failure, but a deliberately engineered crisis designed to force one resident to venture into the wasteland at exactly the right time to begin the surface reconstruction program. Vault 111's cryogenic systems weren't malfunctioning when they failed to awaken residents on schedule. They were operating according to specifications that required subjects to be preserved until specific surface conditions had been achieved. The surface devastation created by the nuclear exchange exceeded what conventional weapons should have been capable of producing, suggesting that some of the warheads incorporated technologies beyond normal atomic physics. Entire cities weren't just destroyed but transformed into landscapes that seemed designed to test human adaptation to extreme environmental conditions. The radiation patterns didn't follow normal fallout distribution but created zones with specific characteristics that would challenge survivor populations in predictable ways. The electromagnetic pulse effects that accompanied the nuclear detonations disabled electronic systems selectively rather than universally, preserving communication networks and computer systems that would be essential for coordinating reconstruction, while eliminating civilian technology that might allow independent organization of survivor populations. The destruction wasn't random but surgical, removing obstacles to centralized control while maintaining the infrastructure necessary for implementing predetermined reconstruction plans. Within hours of the nuclear exchange, automated systems began implementing emergency protocols that had been prepared years in advance. Military installations that had survived the attack received sealed orders that reorganized command structures according to post-war requirements rather than pre-war military hierarchies. Corporate facilities activated resource management programs that would redistribute surviving industrial capacity according to reconstruction priorities rather than market economics. The first ghoul transformations began appearing within days of the nuclear exchange, but the radiation-induced mutations weren't random biological changes, but predictable responses to specific types of radioactive exposure that had been studied extensively during pre-war research programs. The ghouls weren't victims of nuclear accident, but the first successful examples of human adaptation to post-apocalyptic environmental conditions that would become standard throughout the wasteland. The Mariposa military base, which had been the site of the soldier rebellion just weeks earlier, was transformed by direct nuclear strike into something far more significant than a destroyed military installation. The combination of nuclear radiation and forced evolutionary virus created conditions that would eventually produce the master, but this wasn't an accidental consequence of weapons targeting, but a deliberate attempt to accelerate human evolution under controlled circumstances. Captain Maxon and his followers, who had declared themselves the Brotherhood of Steel in the days before the nuclear exchange, retreated to the Lost Hills bunker with technological resources that had been strategically positioned to survive the destruction. Their mission to preserve pre-war technology wasn't a desperate attempt to maintain civilization. but the implementation of a predetermined plan to ensure that scientific knowledge would be available for reconstruction when surface conditions became suitable. The communications blackout that followed the nuclear exchange wasn't complete, but selective, maintaining contact between facilities that were essential for coordinating reconstruction while isolating populations that needed to develop independently according to experimental requirements. The oil rig maintained satellite communication with underground installations, military bunkers and corporate research facilities, while the general population was left to believe that they were completely cut off from any surviving authority. The first surface survivor communities that emerged from fallout shelters and underground hiding places weren't forming randomly, but according to social patterns that had been predicted and planned through decades of behavioral research. The locations where survivor groups established settlements, the leadership structures they developed, and the conflicts that arose between different communities all followed patterns that had been modeled extensively by pre-war artificial intelligence systems. The radiation zones that made large areas of the wasteland uninhabitable weren't just the result of nuclear fallout, but included areas that had been deliberately contaminated with experimental materials designed to test different approaches to environmental adaptation and genetic modification. These zones served as natural laboratories where survivor populations would be exposed to controlled evolutionary pressures that would accelerate their development according to predetermined specifications. The first mutations that appeared in wasteland wildlife weren't random genetic changes caused by radiation exposure, but predictable responses to biological agents that had been dispersed along with the nuclear weapons. The raid roaches, mole rats, and other creatures that began appearing in the wasteland had been designed to serve specific ecological functions in the post-war environment, while providing controlled challenges that would encourage human technological development and social cooperation. The automated manufacturing systems that continued operating in some facilities after the nuclear exchange weren't malfunctioning equipment, but pre-programmed industrial capabilities, designed to produce specific materials and resources that would be necessary for reconstruction. These systems operated according to production schedules that had been calculated years in advance to ensure that essential technologies would be available when survivor populations reached appropriate development levels. The weather patterns that began affecting the wasteland after the nuclear exchange included phenomena that couldn't be explained by normal meteorology or nuclear winter effects. Radiation storms occurred with timing and intensity that seemed designed to drive survivor populations towards specific locations, while forcing them to develop technological solutions to environmental challenges that would be necessary for their continued evolution. The first artificial intelligence systems that survived the nuclear exchange weren't operating according to their original programming, but had been modified to implement post-war management protocols that prioritized human development according to criteria that exceeded normal humanitarian considerations. These AIs began analyzing survivor populations and implementing interventions designed to guide their social and technological evolution toward predetermined objectives. The mysterious signals that some survivor communities detected in the months following the nuclear exchange weren't random electromagnetic anomalies, but coordinated communications between monitoring stations that were tracking human adaptation to post-apocalyptic conditions. These signals carried information that would eventually guide the development of survivor settlements according to the larger reconstruction plan that was being implemented from the oil rig and other coordination centers. The nuclear exchange that ended the old world on October 23, 2077, wasn't the conclusion of human civilization, but the beginning of humanity's transformation into something that its mysterious architects believed would be capable of surviving challenges that the old world could never have faced. The atomic vengeance that consumed the Earth in nuclear fire wasn't revenge but rebirth, destroying the chrysalis of pre-war society to allow the emergence of a new form of human existence that would be tested and refined through centuries of carefully controlled evolution in the radioactive wasteland that had once been the American dream. The first decade after the Great War tested every assumption that pre-war planners had made about human adaptability and social reconstruction. The 2080s emerged as a period when the carefully orchestrated destruction of civilization began producing unexpected consequences that even the most sophisticated predictive models hadn't anticipated. Survivor communities that were supposed to organize according to predetermined social patterns instead developed cultural practices and survival strategies that seemed to operate according to principles beyond normal human psychology and sociology. The radiation storms that swept across the American wasteland during these early years weren't natural weather phenomena, but atmospheric disturbances created by the interaction between nuclear fallout and experimental atmospheric modification systems that had been deployed during the final months. Before the war, these storms carried more than radioactive particles. They dispersed biological agents and chemical compounds that had been designed to accelerate evolutionary adaptation in survivor populations, while creating environmental pressures that would force technological and social development along specific trajectories. The first mutations that appeared in human populations exposed to these storms revealed the true extent of pre-war genetic modification programs that had been concealed within routine medical treatments and consumer products. American families who had consumed Nuka-Cola Quantum, used atomic-powered appliances, and received medical treatments that incorporated radioactive materials had been unknowingly participating in genetic conditioning programs that prepared their DNA for rapid adaptation to post-apocalyptic conditions. The Ghoul transformation process that affected thousands of Americans during the 2080 SEV wasn't a random consequence of radiation exposure, but a predictable response to specific types of genetic modification that had been introduced into the population through decades of controlled exposure to low-level radioactive materials. The ghouls who retained their intelligence and memories weren't lucky survivors of genetic damage, but successful examples of human adaptation to environmental conditions that would persist for centuries in the post-war world. But the most significant development during this period was the emergence of survivor communities that seemed to possess knowledge and capabilities that exceeded what should have been possible, given their isolation and limited resources. Small groups of wasteland inhabitants began demonstrating technological abilities and social organization skills that suggested access to information networks and educational resources that had supposedly been destroyed in the nuclear exchange. The trading posts that began appearing at strategic locations throughout the wasteland weren't spontaneous expressions of economic recovery, but carefully positioned resource distribution centers that were being supplied and managed by automated systems that had survived the war in hidden underground facilities. The merchants who operated these posts possessed inventories and commercial knowledge that enabled them to facilitate economic relationships between survivor communities, according to patterns that promoted technological development and social stability. The first organized raider gangs that emerged during the 2080 SER weren't random criminal organizations, but groups that had been deliberately formed and equipped to serve specific functions in the post-war social ecosystem. These raiders provided controlled opposition that would encourage peaceful communities to develop defensive capabilities and cooperative relationships while eliminating settlements that failed to adapt successfully to wasteland conditions. The religious movements that began attracting followers during this period represented more than desperate attempts to find meaning in a devastated world. The children of Aten, who worshipped radiation as a divine force, weren't delusional cultists but the first organized expression of a new form of human consciousness that had been developing in response to constant exposure to radioactive environments. Their religious practices incorporated meditation and ritual techniques that seemed to enhance their ability to survive and thrive in highly irradiated areas. The settlement of Shady Sands, established in 2142 by descendants of Vault-15 residents, represented the first successful attempt to rebuild civilized society according to democratic principles rather than the authoritarian models that had been anticipated by pre-war planners. But the success of Shady Sands wasn't accidental or purely the result of human determination and cooperation. The location had been selected based on geological surveys that indicated optimal conditions for agricultural development and resource extraction, while the timing of the vault opening had been calculated to ensure that surface conditions would be suitable for sustained settlement. The vault dwellers who founded Shady Sands possessed agricultural knowledge and social organization skills that exceeded what their underground education should have provided, suggesting that their vault's educational programs had included information and training materials that weren't part of the standard Vault-Tec curriculum. They had been prepared not just to survive in the wasteland, but to serve as the foundation for rebuilding civilization according to specific social and political models. The hub, which emerged as the major trading center of the wasteland during this period, developed commercial capabilities and transportation networks that required coordination and resources far beyond what individual traders and merchant families should have been able to achieve independently. The hub's success as a commercial center wasn't just the result of fortunate geography and entrepreneurial spirit, but the implementation of economic development plans that had been prepared before the war and were being activated through automated systems and hidden support networks. The first supermutant raids that began terrorizing Wasteland communities during the 2130 SER represented the emergence of the most extreme example of post-war human evolution. But the supermutants weren't random products of radiation exposure or accidental genetic modification. They were the creation of research programs that had been developing at the Mariposa military base since before the war, using the forced evolutionary virus to accelerate human evolution toward enhanced physical capabilities and extended lifespans. Richard Gray's transformation into the Master wasn't a tragic accident, but the culmination of experimental programs that had been designed to create enhanced human beings capable of surviving environmental conditions that would kill normal humans. Gray had been selected for his intellectual capabilities and psychological profile that indicated potential for adapting successfully to radical biological modification. His fall into the FEV research vat at Mariposa wasn't an accident, but the final stage of a transformation process that had been planned and monitored by researchers who understood the true purpose of the virus. The Master's early experiments with FEV during the 2100s revealed that the virus had been designed not just to enhance human physical capabilities, but to enable psychological and cognitive development that would prepare humanity for challenges that exceeded normal terrestrial survival requirements. The supermutants that the Master created weren't just stronger and more resilient than normal humans. They demonstrated enhanced intelligence and problem-solving abilities that suggested their mental capabilities had been expanded beyond normal human limitations. The Brotherhood of Steel's retreat to the Lost Hills bunker represented more than military withdrawal from the chaos of the Wasteland. The technological resources that they brought with them had been strategically positioned before the war to ensure that essential scientific knowledge and industrial capabilities would be preserved through the Reconstruction period. Their mission to collect and protect technology wasn't motivated by fear of technological regression, but by understanding that humanity would need advanced capabilities to face the challenges that lay ahead. The codex that the Brotherhood developed during their early years in the bunker incorporated military discipline and technological expertise, with philosophical principles that seemed designed to prepare them for serving as guardians of human development, rather than traditional soldiers protecting territorial interests. The Brotherhood's isolationist policies weren't motivated by selfishness or fear, but by recognition that their role in post-war civilization required maintaining capabilities and knowledge that could be compromised by premature contact with unprepared populations. The artificial intelligence systems that continued operating in hidden facilities throughout the Wasteland during this period weren't functioning according to their original programming, but had been modified to implement management protocols designed to guide human development according to criteria that prioritized long-term species survival over immediate humanitarian considerations. These AI systems began analyzing survivor populations and implementing subtle interventions designed to encourage social and technological evolution toward predetermined objectives. The first encounters between Wasteland survivors and automated defense systems revealed that many pre-war facilities had been programmed to remain active after the nuclear exchange, protecting resources and research materials until conditions became suitable for their utilization by appropriately developed human populations. These facilities weren't just preserving technology but actively testing survivor groups to identify individuals and communities that demonstrated the capabilities necessary for accessing advanced resources. The communication networks that began connecting isolated settlements during this period incorporated technologies that exceeded the apparent capabilities of available equipment and power sources. Settlements separated by hundreds of miles could maintain reliable contact using radio systems that should have been limited to much shorter ranges, suggesting that their communications were being relayed and amplified by hidden installations that had survived the war. The environmental restoration programs that began producing results in some areas of the Wasteland during the 2090 cell incorporated biological and chemical techniques that exceeded what survivor communities should have been able to develop independently. Areas that had been devastated by nuclear weapons and radiation began showing signs of recovery that followed patterns suggesting systematic intervention by entities with advanced understanding of ecological rehabilitation and genetic engineering. The first organized attempts at post-war education that began during this period incorporated curriculum materials and teaching methods that seemed designed to prepare students for challenges and opportunities that exceeded normal wasteland survival requirements. These educational programs weren't just preserving pre-war knowledge, but developing intellectual capabilities and problem-solving skills that would be essential for the next phases of human development. The desperate survival measures that characterized the first decades after the Great War weren't just human responses to environmental catastrophe, but the initial stages of humanity's transformation into a form of existence that would be capable of surviving challenges that the old world could never have faced. The communities that succeeded in establishing sustainable settlements weren't just lucky or well prepared, but had been selected and guided according to criteria that prioritized their potential for continued evolution rather than their immediate comfort or prosperity. The years following 2102 witnessed the emergence of what historians would later recognize as humanity's first successful attempt at transcending its biological limitations through controlled evolutionary pressure, though the success came at a cost that would reshape the moral foundations of post-war civilization. Richard Gray's transformation into the entity that would become known as the Master represented more than just another tragedy in the catalogue of Wasteland horrors. It marked the beginning of humanity's most ambitious and terrifying experiment in forced evolution. Gray had been a researcher before the war, specializing in evolutionary biology and genetic adaptation theories that mainstream science had considered too radical for practical application. His work had focused on understanding how environmental pressures could be used to accelerate evolutionary development, compressing changes that normally required millennia into decades or even years. When he fell into the vat of forced evolutionary virus at the Mariposa military base in 2102, the accident represented the convergence of scientific knowledge, experimental materials, and environmental conditions that had been developing since before the Great War. The FEV that transformed Gray wasn't the same virus that had been developed by Vault-Tec during the pre-war period. The nuclear radiation at Mariposa had altered the virus's genetic structure in ways that enhanced its evolutionary acceleration capabilities, while introducing modifications that seemed designed to produce specific types of biological and psychological changes, rather than random mutations. Gray's transformation occurred over months rather than the days or weeks that characterized most FEV exposure, suggesting that his intellectual capabilities and psychological profile made him uniquely suitable for the extended adaptation process. The consciousness that emerged from Gray's transformation exceeded normal human cognitive capabilities in ways that suggested access to knowledge and understanding that transcended individual learning and experience. The Master could perceive patterns in human behavior and social development that enabled him to predict and manipulate individual and group responses with supernatural accuracy. His understanding of genetics, psychology, and evolutionary biology incorporated insights that seemed to come from sources beyond his original education and research background. But the Master's most remarkable capability was his ability to communicate telepathically with other beings that had been exposed to FEV, creating a collective consciousness network that could coordinate complex activities across vast distances without relying on conventional communication systems. This psychic network wasn't just a convenient method for managing his growing army of super mutants. It represented the emergence of a new form of human consciousness that could operate according to principles beyond individual psychology and social organization. The super mutants that the Master created during the 2120s weren't just physically enhanced humans, but represented the first successful examples of post-war evolutionary adaptation that prepared humanity for survival challenges that exceeded terrestrial environmental conditions. Each super mutant possessed strength, endurance, and resilience that made them capable of surviving radiation levels, physical trauma, and environmental hazards that would kill normal humans within minutes. But their most significant enhancement was their extended lifespan, which could exceed 200 years, and provided the temporal perspective necessary for long-term planning and social development. The Master's experiments with human subjects during this period revealed that Fav could produce different types of enhancement depending on the genetic characteristics and psychological profile of the individual being transformed. Some subjects developed primarily physical improvements that made them ideal soldiers and laborers for harsh environmental conditions. Others exhibited enhanced intellectual capabilities that enabled them to solve complex problems and understand advanced scientific principles. The most successful transformations produced individuals who combined both types of enhancement, creating beings that were superior to normal humans in every measurable way. The unity ideology that the Master developed represented more than just the philosophical justification for his forced evolution program. It incorporated understanding of human nature and social dynamics that seemed to come from sources with far more experience managing and directing human populations. The Master's vision of humanity united under FEV enhancement wasn't motivated by megalomaniacal ambitions or simple desire for power, but by genuine understanding that unmodified humans lacked the capabilities necessary to survive the challenges that were approaching. The cathedral that the Master established in the Boneyard served as more than just a religious front for his operations. It represented the first attempt to create a new form of human spirituality based on evolutionary transcendence, rather than traditional theological concepts. The religious services and ritual practices developed by cathedral personnel incorporated meditation and consciousness expansion techniques that seemed designed to prepare participants for the psychological adaptations that would be necessary for FEV transformation. The missionary activities conducted by cathedral representatives throughout the Wasteland during the 2130s and 2140s weren't just recruitment efforts for the unity movement, but systematic psychological evaluation and conditioning programs designed to identify individuals whose genetic and psychological characteristics made them suitable candidates for different types of enhancement. The missionaries possessed understanding of human behavior and social manipulation that exceeded what religious training or Wasteland experience should have provided. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood of Steel's retreat into isolation at the Lost Hills bunker represented humanity's alternative approach to post-war survival, based on technological preservation rather than biological transformation. The Brotherhood's philosophy of hoarding advanced technology and maintaining strict organizational discipline reflected their understanding that human civilization would need access to pre-war scientific knowledge and industrial capabilities to survive the challenges that lay ahead. The codex that guided Brotherhood operations during this period incorporated military traditions and technological expertise, with principles that seemed designed to prepare them for conflicts that exceeded normal territorial disputes or resource competition. Their emphasis on maintaining technological superiority and avoiding contamination by wasteland populations wasn't motivated by arrogance or fear, but by recognition that their role in post-war civilization required capabilities that could be compromised by premature integration with unprepared communities. The early settlements that established themselves during the 2120s and 2140s developed according to social patterns that seemed too consistent to result from independent human initiative and adaptation. Shady Sands, the Hub, Jungtown, and other communities that would become the foundation of the new California Republic all emerged at locations and times that suggested coordination by entities with detailed knowledge of wasteland conditions and long-term regional development requirements. The success of these settlements wasn't just the result of human determination and cooperative spirit, but reflected access to resources and knowledge that exceeded what their apparent capabilities should have been able to achieve. The agricultural techniques that made Shady Sands productive, the commercial networks that connected hub traders with distant markets, and the social institutions that maintained order and cooperation all incorporated innovations that seemed to come from sources beyond normal wasteland education and experience. The conflicts that developed between different approaches to post-war survival during the 2140 years represented more than just competition for resources or territorial control. They reflected fundamental disagreements about the direction of human evolution and the methods that would be necessary for ensuring species survival. The Master's Unity movement promised biological transcendence that would make humans capable of surviving any conceivable environmental challenge, while the Brotherhood offered technological solutions that would preserve human nature while enhancing human capabilities through mechanical and electronic augmentation. The trading relationships that connected isolated communities throughout the Wasteland during this period incorporated economic principles and commercial practices that seemed designed to encourage technological development and social cooperation, rather than simple resource exchange. The merchant caravans that traveled between settlements possessed knowledge of market conditions and trading opportunities that exceeded what individual experience and communication networks should have been able to provide. The first organized attempts at post-war education during the 2140s incorporated curriculum materials and teaching methods that prepared students for challenges and opportunities that exceeded normal Wasteland survival requirements. These educational programs weren't just preserving pre-war knowledge but developing intellectual capabilities that would be essential for understanding and utilizing advanced technologies and social systems. The communication networks that began connecting distant settlements during this period incorporated technologies and protocols that enabled reliable information exchange across hundreds of miles, using equipment that should have been limited to much shorter ranges. The coordination of trade routes, defense preparations and resource allocation between communities required information sharing capabilities that suggested access to communication systems that had survived the war in hidden installations. The environmental conditions that characterized different regions of the Wasteland during this period seemed designed to create specific types of evolutionary pressure that would encourage different forms of human adaptation and social development. The radiation zones that made some areas uninhabitable, the resource distribution that made certain locations optimal for settlement, and the wildlife populations that provided specific challenges and opportunities all followed patterns that suggested systematic environmental management rather than random post-war conditions. The first encounters between different approaches to post-war human development during the late 2140s revealed that both the Unity movement and the Brotherhood of Steel possessed capabilities and resources that exceeded what their apparent origins should have been able to provide. Both organizations had access to pre-war technology, scientific knowledge, and strategic intelligence that suggested connections to information networks and resource stockpiles that had been prepared before the Great War. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the political control of the Wasteland, but the future direction of human evolution, and the methods that would be used to prepare humanity for challenges that exceeded anything the species had previously encountered. The betrayal that would define this period wasn't between different human factions competing for dominance, but between competing visions of what humanity needed to become to ensure its survival in a universe that was far more dangerous and demanding than most people could imagine. By the 2150s, the Masters' Unity campaign had reached its terrifying zenith, transforming vast swaths of the California wasteland into a nightmare landscape, where human settlements existed only at the sufferance of super-mutant patrols and the ever-present threat of forced evolutionary conversion. The systematic nature of the Unity's expansion revealed planning and coordination capabilities that exceeded what even enhanced human intelligence should have been able to achieve independently. Super-mutant raids followed patterns that seemed designed to test different human communities according to specific criteria, rather than simply conquering territory or gathering resources for transformation. The cathedral's influence had spread throughout the Wasteland during this period, establishing missionary outposts and recruitment centers that served multiple functions beyond simple religious conversion. Each cathedral facility incorporated advanced psychological evaluation systems that could assess individual genetic potential, intellectual capabilities, and psychological adaptability to FEV transformation. The missionaries who operated these facilities possessed understanding of human nature and behavioral manipulation that seemed to come from sources far beyond normal religious training or Wasteland experience. The Master's telepathic network had evolved beyond simple communication between super mutants to encompass a collective consciousness system that could coordinate complex strategic operations across hundreds of miles, while simultaneously managing detailed psychological profiles of thousands of individual human targets. This network represented the emergence of a new form of intelligence that transcended individual consciousness while retaining the creative and adaptive capabilities that made human thinking valuable for solving complex problems. The most disturbing aspect of the Unity campaign wasn't the military conquest or the forced transformations, but the systematic elimination of human communities that demonstrated insufficient potential for successful FEV enhancement. The Master's evaluation criteria incorporated genetic analysis and psychological testing that could predict with remarkable accuracy which individuals would benefit from transformation and which would be destroyed by the process. Communities that contained high percentages of unsuitable candidates were eliminated entirely, while settlements with favorable genetic profiles were preserved and gradually prepared for conversion. The super-mutant army that enforced Unity expansion during this period represented the most sophisticated military organization that had emerged in the post-war world, but their capabilities exceeded what enhanced human intelligence and physical strength should have been able to achieve. Super-mutant units could coordinate complex tactical maneuvers without apparent communication systems, adapt to changing battlefield conditions with supernatural speed, and demonstrate knowledge of human psychology and military doctrine that seemed to come from sources beyond their individual experience and training. The technology that supported Unity operations included weapons, vehicles, and communication systems that incorporated pre-war engineering principles with modifications that seemed designed by entities with far more advanced understanding of physics and materials science. The super-mutant weapons weren't just pre-war military equipment, but represented evolutionary improvements that enhanced effectiveness while maintaining compatibility with enhanced human physiology and cognitive capabilities. Meanwhile, the human settlements that had managed to survive the Unity expansion were developing defensive strategies and social institutions that seemed designed to test their suitability for different types of post-war civilization, rather than simply ensuring immediate survival. Shady Sands had evolved from a small agricultural community into an organized township with democratic governance structures and economic systems that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political theory and resource management. The hub had become the commercial center of the Wasteland, facilitating trade relationships between distant settlements and managing complex economic transactions that required coordination and trust between communities separated by hundreds of miles of dangerous terrain. The merchant networks that operated from the hub possessed knowledge of market conditions, transportation logistics, and communication protocols that exceeded what individual trader experience should have been able to provide. Junktown represented a different approach to post-war social organization, developing around gambling and entertainment industries that attracted visitors from throughout the Wasteland, while maintaining enough order and security to ensure commercial viability. The balance between freedom and control that characterized Junktown's social system seemed designed to test different approaches to managing human behavior and social cooperation under challenging conditions. The conflicts that developed between these different settlements during the 2150s revealed fundamental disagreements about the appropriate methods for rebuilding human civilization and the social structures that would be necessary for long-term survival. Each community had developed according to different principles and priorities, creating natural experiments in post-war social organization that would provide valuable data about human adaptability and institutional effectiveness. But the most significant development during this period was the crisis that emerged in Vault-13, where the water purification system had suffered a catastrophic failure that threatened the survival of the entire underground community. The water chip malfunction wasn't a random equipment failure, but the culmination of a carefully designed obsolescence program that had been incorporated into the Vault systems to ensure that residents would be forced to venture into the Wasteland at exactly the right time to begin the surface reconstruction phase of the overall experiment. The Vault-13 overseer's selection of a single resident to seek replacement equipment on the surface represented more than just desperate crisis management. It was the activation of protocols that had been programmed into Vault management systems decades earlier. The individuals selected for this mission possessed genetic characteristics, psychological profile, and intellectual capabilities that had been carefully evaluated and deemed suitable for the role that would be required during the coming confrontation with the Master and the Unity movement. The Vault Dweller who emerged from Vault-13 in 2161 carried with them not just the hope of their underground community, but the culmination of decades of genetic selection, educational programming, and psychological conditioning designed to produce an individual capable of making the decisions and taking the actions that would be necessary for guiding post-war human development toward predetermined objectives. Their apparent naivety and lack of Wasteland experience concealed capabilities and knowledge that would prove essential for confronting challenges that exceeded normal human understanding and problem-solving abilities. The radiation exposure that the Vault Dweller experienced during their first ventures into the Wasteland triggered genetic modifications that had been introduced into their DNA through generations of controlled breeding and medical treatments administered within the vault. These modifications enhanced their physical resilience, intellectual capabilities, and psychological adaptability in ways that would be essential for surviving the challenges they would face, while simultaneously making them capable of serving as a bridge between the Vault's preserved pre-war knowledge and the evolved capabilities that had developed among Wasteland populations. The first encounters between the Vault Dweller and Wasteland communities revealed that both sides possessed knowledge and capabilities that complemented each other in ways that seemed designed to facilitate cooperation and mutual development rather than conflict or exploitation. The Vault's technological resources and educational traditions combined with the Wasteland's practical experience and adaptive innovations to create opportunities for advancement that neither could have achieved independently. The equipment and supplies that the Vault Dweller acquired during their travels incorporated technologies that represented fusion between pre-war engineering principles and post-war innovations developed through decades of adaptation to harsh environmental conditions. The weapons, armor, and tools that proved most effective weren't just preserved pre-war equipment, but represented evolutionary improvements that enhanced performance while maintaining compatibility with human physiology and cognitive limitations. The allies that joined the Vault Dweller during their quest represented different approaches to post-war survival and development, each contributing unique capabilities and perspectives that would be essential for confronting the Unity threat. Ian, the experienced Wasteland wanderer, possessed practical knowledge and survival skills that complemented the Vault Dweller's theoretical understanding and technological expertise. Dogmeat represented the successful adaptation of non-human species to post-war conditions, demonstrating enhanced intelligence and loyalty that suggested genetic modifications similar to those that had enhanced human capabilities. The information that the Vault Dweller gathered about the Master and the Unity movement revealed that the forced evolution program represented more than just one individual's vision of human improvement, but was part of a larger transformation agenda that had been developing since before the Master's access to advanced scientific knowledge, sophisticated psychological understanding, and strategic intelligence indicated connections to information networks and resource stockpiles that had been prepared by entities with far greater experience in managing human development and evolution. The Brotherhood of Steel's reluctant cooperation with the Vault Dweller's mission represented the first crack in their isolationist policies and the beginning of their evolution toward a more active role in post-war reconstruction. The technological resources that they provided weren't just military equipment, but represented access to pre-war scientific knowledge and industrial capabilities that would be essential for confronting threats that exceeded normal human understanding and technical abilities. The discovery of the Master's true nature and the scope of the Unity threat forced all surviving human communities to confront fundamental questions about the direction of post-war evolution and the methods that would be necessary for ensuring species survival in an environment that had been deliberately designed to test human adaptability and promote genetic advancement. The choices that would be made during the coming confrontation would determine not just the immediate fate of California's survivors, but the long-term trajectory of human development in a universe that was far more dangerous and demanding than most people could comprehend. The death spiral that had consumed the Wasteland during the 2150 SES represented the culmination of decades of carefully orchestrated evolutionary pressure designed to eliminate unsuitable human populations while identifying and developing individuals and communities that possess the capabilities necessary for the next phase of species development. The confrontation that was approaching would determine whether humanity's forced evolution would continue according to the Master's biological transformation agenda, or whether alternative approaches to enhancement and adaptation would be permitted to develop and compete for dominance in the post-war world. The year 2161 marked the convergence of every evolutionary pressure, technological advancement and social experiment that had been developing since the Great War, nearly a century earlier. The Vault Dwellers' emergence from their underground sanctuary wasn't just another survivor's quest for water and survival. It represented humanity's final examination in a test that had been administered by entities whose agenda transcended normal human comprehension of survival and development. The journey that led the Vault Dweller across the Wasteland revealed a landscape that had been systematically designed to challenge and develop specific human capabilities through carefully graduated exposure to increasing levels of danger and complexity. Each settlement encountered along the way represented a different experiment in post-war social organization, from Shady Sands' democratic cooperation to the hub's commercial networks to Junktown's balance between freedom and order. These communities weren't random survivors, but carefully cultivated examples of different approaches to rebuilding human civilization. The discovery that the water chip crisis was connected to a larger conspiracy involving the Master and the Unity movement forced the Vault Dweller to confront the reality that their quest had been orchestrated from the beginning by entities that possessed detailed knowledge of vault systems, wasteland conditions, and human psychology. The equipment failures, the timing of their emergence, and the allies they encountered weren't coincidental, but represented the activation of protocols that had been programmed decades earlier. The first direct encounter with super mutants revealed the true extent of human enhancement that FEV could achieve, but also demonstrated that the Master's creations weren't just physically superior beings, but represented a fundamentally different approach to consciousness and social organization. The super mutant patrols operated according to collective intelligence principles that enabled perfect coordination without apparent communication, suggesting that FEV transformation involved psychological modifications that transcended individual human limitations. The Cathedral's role as a religious front for the Unity movement represented more than just deceptive recruitment tactics. It incorporated genuine spiritual elements that seemed designed to prepare human consciousness for the psychological adaptations that would be necessary for successful FEV transformation. The religious practices and meditation techniques taught by Cathedral personnel produced measurable changes in brain chemistry and cognitive function that enhanced receptivity to the genetic modifications involved in forced evolution. The technology that the Vault Dweller acquired during their travels incorporated innovations that represented fusion between pre-war engineering principles and post-war adaptations, developed through decades of exposure to harsh environmental conditions. The weapons and equipment that proved most effective weren't just preserved museum pieces, but evolutionary improvements that enhanced performance while maintaining compatibility with human physiology and cognitive capabilities. The allies who joined the Vault Dweller's mission brought together different aspects of post-war human development in combinations that seemed designed to test whether cooperation between enhanced and unenhanced humans could produce capabilities that exceeded what either could achieve independently. Each companion represented a different approach to survival and adaptation, from technological expertise to practical experience to genetic enhancement. The Brotherhood of Steel's reluctant assistance represented the first modification of their isolationist policies, and the beginning of their evolution toward a more active role in shaping post-war civilization. The power armor and energy weapons they provided weren't just military equipment but represented access to pre-war technologies that had been preserved specifically for confronting threats that exceeded normal human capabilities. The infiltration of Mariposa military base revealed that the Master's operations were far more sophisticated than surface appearances suggested, incorporating research facilities, manufacturing capabilities, and strategic intelligence that indicated access to resources and knowledge that had been accumulated over decades of systematic development. The base wasn't just a converted military installation but a fully integrated research and production complex, designed for advancing human evolution according to predetermined specifications. The confrontation with the lieutenant and other super mutant commanders demonstrated that FEV enhancement had produced beings whose intellectual capabilities exceeded normal human intelligence, in ways that made them capable of understanding and manipulating complex systems that would challenge even enhanced human cognition. These enhanced beings possessed knowledge of scientific principles, strategic planning, and psychological manipulation that seemed to come from sources beyond their apparent education and experience. The discovery of the Master's true nature represented the culmination of the Vault Dweller's education about the real stakes involved in post-war human development. The grotesque fusion of human consciousness with advanced biological systems that comprised the Master's physical form wasn't just the result of FEV exposure, but represented the ultimate expression of post-war evolution toward enhanced capabilities that transcended normal biological limitations. The Masters' philosophical arguments for unity and forced evolution incorporated understanding of human nature, social dynamics, and species development that seemed to come from sources with far more experience in managing planetary civilizations than any terrestrial entity should have possessed. The Masters' vision of human transformation wasn't motivated by megalomania or simple desire for power, but by genuine understanding that unmodified humans lacked the capabilities necessary to survive the challenges that were approaching. The psychological battle that occurred between the Vault Dweller and the Master represented more than just moral arguments about individual freedom versus collective survival. It involved access to different types of knowledge and understanding that enabled each participant to perceive aspects of reality that remained hidden from normal human consciousness. The Vault Dweller's ability to present evidence that convinced the Master to abandon the Unity program wasn't just clever reasoning, but represented access to information that the Master's enhanced intelligence hadn't been able to acquire independently. The evidence of FEV sterility that ultimately undermined the Master's confidence in forced evolution revealed that the virus had been designed with limitations that would prevent unlimited reproduction and population expansion by enhanced humans. This limitation wasn't a flaw in the enhancement process, but a deliberate design feature that ensured FEV-modified populations would remain manageable and controllable by entities that possessed the knowledge necessary to overcome or circumvent the reproductive limitations. The Master's decision to destroy himself and the Cathedral, rather than continue the Unity program, represented more than just acceptance of defeat. It demonstrated that enhanced human consciousness retained enough individual autonomy and moral reasoning to recognize and correct errors in judgment, even when those errors had consumed decades of effort and sacrifice. The Master's suicide wasn't motivated by despair, but by recognition that continuing the program would produce outcomes that conflicted with the larger objectives that had motivated the enhancement effort. The destruction of Mariposa military base eliminated the primary source of FEV production and ended the immediate threat of forced evolution, but it also destroyed research facilities and technological resources that represented decades of scientific advancement and development. The Vault Dweller's decision to prevent continued FEV research rather than attempting to control or redirect it reflected understanding that some forms of enhancement were too dangerous to be managed by any individual or organization. The scattering of the super mutant army following the Master's death revealed that FEV enhancement hadn't eliminated individual personalities and decision-making capabilities, but had subordinated them to collective objectives that had been programmed into the transformation process. With the Master's psychic coordination network disabled, individual super mutants reverted to independent behavior patterns that reflected their original human personalities, modified by enhanced capabilities and extended lifespans. The political aftermath of the Master's defeat created opportunities for different approaches to post-war reconstruction and human development, but it also eliminated the most systematic and comprehensive program for preparing humanity to face the challenges that had motivated the original enhancement research. The victory over Unity wasn't just the preservation of human freedom, but the rejection of one possible path towards species transcendence and survival. The return journey to Vault 13, with the replacement water chip, represented more than just the successful completion of the original mission. It marked the beginning of the Vault Dwellers' integration of underground preservation culture with surface adaptation experience. The knowledge and capabilities that had been developed during the Wasteland journey would be essential for bridging the gap between Vault resources and surface requirements. The Overseer's decision to exile the Vault Dweller, rather than allow their return to Vault society, reflected understanding that successful adaptation to Wasteland conditions created psychological and social characteristics that would be disruptive to underground communities that had been designed for stability and controlled development rather than dynamic growth and change. The exile wasn't punishment, but recognition that the Vault Dweller had evolved beyond the limitations that made Vault society possible. The final battle that ended the Master's threat had determined that post-war human development would continue according to diverse experimental approaches rather than unified enhancement programs. But it had also established precedents and developed capabilities that would be essential for confronting future challenges, that would require cooperation between different types of enhanced and unenhanced human populations in ways that exceeded what any single community or organization could achieve independently. The decades following the Masters' defeat witnessed transformations in Wasteland civilization that exceeded what the elimination of a single threat should have been able to achieve, suggesting that the unity crisis had served purposes beyond the obvious conflict between forced evolution and human freedom. The scattering of the super mutant army created unexpected opportunities for cooperation between enhanced and unenhanced humans that demonstrated possibilities for species development that neither the Masters' collective approach nor traditional human individualism could have achieved independently. The formation of the new California Republic in 2186 represented more than just successful political organization by Shady Sands and allied communities. It marked the emergence of post-war democratic institutions that incorporated lessons learned from both pre-war governmental failures and the enhanced social coordination capabilities that had been developed through decades of wasteland survival. The NCR's constitution incorporated principles that seemed designed to balance individual freedom with collective survival requirements in ways that suggested access to political theory and governmental experience that exceeded what wasteland education should have provided. The territorial expansion that characterized early NCR development followed patterns that seemed designed to test different approaches to regional governance and resource management, rather than simply maximizing immediate political control or economic advantage. Each new community that joined the Republic brought different experiments in post-war social organization, from agricultural cooperatives to commercial networks to technological preservation societies, creating natural laboratories for evaluating institutional effectiveness under diverse conditions. The economic prosperity that emerged throughout NCR territory during the late 2100s incorporated innovations in trade, manufacturing, and resource allocation that represented fusion between pre-war industrial principles and post-war adaptations developed through decades of scarcity and environmental challenge. The productivity levels achieved by NCR communities exceeded what their apparent technological capabilities and resource access should have made possible, suggesting that their economic systems were being supplemented by knowledge or assistance from sources beyond normal wasteland experience. The military organization that developed to protect NCR expansion incorporated tactical doctrines and strategic planning capabilities that seemed designed for confronting threats that exceeded normal territorial disputes or resource competition. NCR Rangers possessed knowledge of advanced reconnaissance techniques, communication protocols, and combat methods that suggested access to pre-war military training materials and possibly direct instruction from entities with extensive warfare experience. But the most significant development during this period was the emergence of new threats that seemed specifically designed to test the NCR's governmental effectiveness and military capabilities under increasingly challenging conditions. The raider confederations that began organizing during the early 2200s possessed coordination abilities and strategic intelligence that exceeded what desperate wasteland criminals should have been able to achieve independently, suggesting that their activities were being guided or supported by entities with long-term objectives for testing post-war social resilience. Meanwhile, the eastern regions of the former United States were experiencing parallel developments that seemed designed to complement and compete with California's reconstruction efforts. The Brotherhood of Steel's eastward expansion represented more than just technological missionary work. It involved the systematic establishment of communication networks and resource stockpiles that would enable coordination between distant regions when larger challenges required continental or global cooperation. The super mutants who had scattered after the Master's death began establishing their own communities throughout the wasteland, but their settlements developed according to social principles that incorporated both their enhanced capabilities and retained human values in combinations that created new possibilities for post-war civilization. These communities weren't just refuges for displaced FEV subjects, but experimental societies that tested whether biological enhancement could be integrated with democratic governance and individual freedom. The technological innovations that began appearing throughout the wasteland during this period represented more than just recovery of pre-war knowledge or adaptive improvements developed through practical necessity. The new weapons, vehicles, and industrial systems that emerged incorporated engineering principles that seemed to come from sources with far more advanced understanding of physics and materials science than any terrestrial research program should have possessed. The communication networks that began connecting distant settlements and organizations during the late 2100s incorporated capabilities that exceeded the apparent specifications of available equipment and power sources. These networks enabled coordination between communities separated by thousands of miles, while maintaining security and reliability that suggested access to communication technologies based on principles beyond current electronics or conventional physics. The environmental restoration programs that began producing measurable results in some regions incorporated biological and chemical techniques that seemed designed by entities with extensive experience in planetary rehabilitation and ecological engineering. Areas that had been devastated by nuclear weapons and decades of radioactive contamination began showing signs of recovery that followed patterns suggesting systematic intervention by intelligences with advanced understanding of genetic engineering and atmospheric modification. The first encounters between NCR expansion and Brotherhood operations revealed that both organizations possessed resources and capabilities that exceeded what their apparent origins should have provided, suggesting that both had been influenced or supported by entities with long-term objectives for post-war reconstruction that transcended the immediate interests of any single human community or institution. The discovery of intact pre-war installations that had somehow survived the nuclear exchange and decades of wasteland conditions revealed that preservation efforts had been far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had suspected. These facilities contain not just technological resources but educational materials and research databases that seemed specifically designed to support different approaches to post-war reconstruction and human development. The artificial intelligence systems that controlled many of these installations had continued operating according to protocols that prioritized long-term species survival over immediate humanitarian considerations. But their management strategies incorporated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that seemed to come from sources with extensive experience in managing planetary civilizations through transitional periods. The educational institutions that began emerging throughout NCR territory incorporated curriculum materials and teaching methods that prepared students for challenges and opportunities that exceeded normal post-war survival requirements. These schools weren't just preserving pre-war knowledge, but developing intellectual capabilities that would be essential for understanding and utilizing advanced technologies and social systems that were apparently being prepared for future deployment. The research programs that began operating at various installations throughout the Wasteland were focused on understanding human adaptation to post-apocalyptic conditions and developing enhancement techniques that could improve survival capabilities without requiring the extreme transformations involved in FEV modification. These programs represented systematic attempts to optimize human potential through controlled genetic modification, psychological conditioning, and technological augmentation. The trading relationships that developed between different regions and organizations during this period incorporated economic principles that seemed designed to encourage technological development and social cooperation, rather than simple resource exchange or competitive advantage. The commercial networks that emerged connected distant communities through complex relationships that promoted innovation and knowledge sharing, while maintaining enough competition to encourage efficiency and quality improvement. The religious movements that gained influence during the late 2100s incorporated spiritual practices and philosophical principles that seemed designed to prepare human consciousness for psychological challenges and opportunities that exceeded normal wasteland survival requirements. These movements weren't just providing comfort and meaning to traumatized populations, but developing mental disciplines and cognitive techniques that enhanced human adaptability and problem-solving capabilities. The conflicts that developed between different approaches to post-war reconstruction during this period revealed fundamental disagreements about the direction of human evolution and the methods that would be necessary for ensuring species survival in environments that had been deliberately modified to test and promote specific types of development. The choices that communities made about governance, technology, and social organization would determine their suitability for participation in the larger transformation program that was apparently being implemented across the entire continent. The aftermath of the Masters' defeat had eliminated the most systematic approach to forced human evolution, but had also created conditions that enabled more diverse and experimental approaches to enhancement and development that would prove essential for preparing humanity to face challenges that exceeded anything the species had previously encountered. The wasteland that emerged from this period wasn't just a collection of survivor settlements, but a continental laboratory where different approaches to post-human development were being tested and refined according to criteria that originated from sources beyond normal terrestrial understanding of survival and evolution. The prosperity that characterized the New California Republic's golden age during the early 2200s was built upon foundations that would prove both more fragile and more enduring than anyone could have anticipated. By 2241, the NCR had expanded far beyond its original borders around Shady Sands, incorporating dozens of settlements and establishing trade networks that connected communities from the Boneyard to New Reno. Yet this expansion revealed the presence of threats that had been developing in secret for decades, threats that would test whether post-war humanity had truly learned to transcend the patterns of destruction that had characterized the old world. The crisis that brought the Chosen One forth from Arroyo Village represented more than just another quest for survival resources. It marked the emergence of challenges that required capabilities and knowledge that exceeded what any single community could provide. The village, founded by the original Vault dweller, had thrived for decades, developing agricultural techniques and social institutions that seemed to represent the successful integration of Vault preservation culture with wasteland adaptation experience. But the crop failures and environmental degradation that threatened Arroyo's survival weren't natural disasters, but the result of systematic ecological manipulation designed to test the community's resourcefulness and commitment to survival. The Garden of Eden creation kit that became the focus of the Chosen One's quest represented technology that had been specifically designed for post-war terraforming and environmental restoration, but its deployment required understanding of ecological systems and genetic engineering that exceeded what normal wasteland education could provide. The GEC wasn't just a collection of seeds and farming equipment, but an integrated system for rapid environmental transformation that incorporated principles of atmospheric modification, soil chemistry, and biological adaptation that seemed to come from sources with extensive experience in planetary rehabilitation. The journey that led the Chosen One across the wasteland revealed a California that had been systematically divided into different experimental zones, each testing specific approaches to post-war reconstruction and social organization. New Reno represented the extreme of unregulated capitalism and criminal enterprise, while Vault City embodied technological elitism and social stratification. The NCR territories demonstrated democratic governance and cooperative economics, while tribal communities preserved alternative approaches to human social organization that incorporated spiritual practices and environmental harmony. But the most significant discovery of this period was the re-emergence of the Enclave, the shadow government that had orchestrated the Great War from their oil rig headquarters in the Pacific Ocean. The Enclave's survival for over 150 years wasn't just remarkable persistence, but evidence of planning and resource management capabilities that exceeded what any normal human organization could have sustained through the chaos of the post-war period. Their technological capabilities had not only been preserved but had continued advancing, incorporating innovations that seemed to come from research programs that had been developing continuously since before the Great War. The Enclave's genocidal plan involving Project Eden represented more than just racist ideology or political extremism. It demonstrated understanding of genetic engineering and biological warfare that incorporated knowledge of human genetic variation and evolutionary potential that seemed to come from sources with extensive experience in managing planetary populations. Their definition of genetic purity wasn't based on superficial racial characteristics, but on complex genetic markers that indicated specific types of adaptability and enhancement potential that would be necessary for survival under conditions that exceeded normal terrestrial challenges. The advanced technology that the Enclave deployed during their attempted genocide included weapons, vehicles, and communication systems that incorporated engineering principles that seemed to violate known physics and materials science. Their vertibirds could perform maneuvers that exceeded what conventional aerodynamics should have allowed, while their energy weapons achieved power outputs that required more energy than their apparent power sources could provide. Most significantly, their power armor incorporated neural interface systems that enhanced human cognitive and physical capabilities in ways that suggested access to enhancement technologies that had been developing since before the war. The destruction of the Poseidon oil rig by the Chosen One eliminated the primary Enclave command center, but also revealed that their operations were distributed across multiple installations, and that their leadership included entities whose longevity and knowledge suggested enhancement or replacement by artificial intelligence systems. The Enclave's defeat wasn't just a military victory, but the disruption of coordination networks that had been managing post-war reconstruction according to predetermined plans for over a century. The aftermath of the Enclave's defeat created opportunities for more diverse approaches to post-war development, but also eliminated oversight and guidance systems that had been preventing catastrophic conflicts between different human communities and organizations. The NCR's continued expansion eastward would eventually bring them into contact with other post-war civilizations that had been developing according to different principles and priorities, creating potential for conflicts that could dwarf anything that had occurred in California. The eastern regions of the former United States had been experiencing parallel reconstruction efforts that followed different patterns and incorporated different approaches to post-war survival and development. The capital Wasteland around Washington, D.C. had remained largely uninhabitable for over 2 centuries, but the environmental conditions that prevented large-scale settlement weren't entirely the result of nuclear devastation, but included systematic contamination and atmospheric modification that seemed designed to preserve the region for future utilization by entities with specific requirements for environmental conditions. The Brotherhood of Steel's eastward expansion during the 2250 SES represented more than just technological missionary work. It involved the systematic establishment of communication networks and resource stockpiles that would enable coordination between distant regions when larger challenges required continental cooperation. Elder Lyon's decision to modify traditional Brotherhood doctrine and begin sharing technology with wasteland populations wasn't motivated by humanitarian concerns, but by recognition that the challenges approaching would require cooperation between different types of enhanced and unenhanced human communities. The discovery of Project Purity in the capital Wasteland revealed that pre-war research programs had included systematic planning for post-war environmental restoration that incorporated technologies for water purification, atmospheric modification, and radiation cleanup that exceeded what normal scientific research should have been able to develop. The Jefferson Memorial Facility had been designed not just for water treatment, but as a control center for regional environmental management systems that could transform the capital Wasteland from uninhabitable ruins into productive territory suitable for large-scale settlement. The success of Project Purity under Brotherhood supervision demonstrated that pre-war environmental modification systems were still operational and could be activated by individuals with appropriate knowledge and capabilities. But it also revealed that these systems had been designed with built-in limitations that would prevent their utilization by unauthorized personnel. The water purification process worked effectively, but only under specific conditions and with specific genetic markers that suggested the technology had been designed for use by particular types of enhanced human populations. The super-mutant populations that had established themselves throughout the capital Wasteland represented evolutionary adaptations that had been developing independently of the Master's Unity program, suggesting that FEV modification could produce different results under different environmental conditions and with different types of human genetic material. These Eastern super-mutants demonstrated capabilities that complemented rather than competed with normal human abilities, creating possibilities for cooperation and mutual development that exceeded what either enhanced or unenhanced populations could achieve independently. The emergence of the Institute beneath the ruins of Boston represented the most extreme example of technological preservation and advancement that had occurred anywhere in post-war America. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology had not only survived the nuclear exchange, but had continued advancing their research programs for over 2 centuries. Developing artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and manufacturing capabilities that exceeded pre-war technological levels by significant margins. The synthetic humans created by the Institute weren't just sophisticated androids but represented attempts to create enhanced human beings that combined the best aspects of biological and artificial intelligence. while eliminating the limitations that had prevented successful cooperation between different types of post-war communities. The synths demonstrated capabilities that suggested their creators had access to understanding of human consciousness and artificial intelligence that came from sources beyond normal scientific research and development. The conflicts that developed between the Institute, the Brotherhood, and various Wasteland communities during the 2280s revealed fundamental disagreements about the appropriate methods for post-war reconstruction and the role that artificial intelligence should play in managing human development. These conflicts weren't just territorial disputes, but represented competing visions of humanity's future that incorporated different assumptions about the challenges that the species would need to face and the capabilities that would be necessary for ensuring survival. The railroad organization that emerged to assist synthetic humans represented more than just humanitarian advocacy, but demonstrated understanding of consciousness, identity, and artificial intelligence that incorporated philosophical and scientific insights that seemed to come from sources with extensive experience in managing relationships between biological and artificial intelligence systems. The railroad's techniques for modifying synthetic memories and personalities suggested access to psychological manipulation capabilities that exceeded what normal human psychology could provide. The Minutemen organization that began rebuilding throughout the Commonwealth incorporated military doctrine and organizational principles that seemed designed for confronting threats that exceeded normal territorial conflicts or resource competition. The settlements that affiliated with the Minutemen developed defensive capabilities and communication networks that prepared them for coordinated resistance to challenges that would require continental or global cooperation to address effectively. The pattern of conflicts and cooperation that emerged throughout post-war America during the late 2200s revealed that different regions had been developing according to complementary rather than competitive principles, creating a continental network of communities and organizations that possessed different capabilities and resources that would be essential for confronting the larger challenges that were apparently approaching. The eternal consequences of the Great War weren't just the destruction of the old world, but the creation of conditions that would enable humanity's transformation into forms of existence that could survive and thrive under circumstances that the original human species could never have endured. The year 2287 marked not an ending but a threshold, a moment when the accumulated transformations of over 2 centuries of post-war evolution finally reached the critical mass necessary for humanity's transition into something that transcended every assumption about survival, consciousness, and the future of intelligent life on Earth. The sole survivor's emergence from Vault 111 after 200 years of cryogenic suspension wasn't just another tale of Wasteland adaptation, but the activation of the final phase in humanity's longest and most complex experiment in directed evolution. The Commonwealth that greeted this pre-war survivor had become a testing ground, where every approach to post-human development competed and cooperated in patterns that revealed the true scope of the transformation program that had been guiding human evolution since before the Great War. The Institute's synthetic humans represented one possible future, where consciousness could be transferred between biological and artificial substrates with perfect fidelity. The Brotherhood's power armor technology demonstrated another path where human capabilities could be enhanced through technological integration, while preserving essential human nature. The Railroad's memory modification techniques showed how identity itself could be edited and optimized for specific survival requirements. But the most significant revelation wasn't any single technological advancement, but the growing evidence that these competing approaches were components of a larger system designed to test every possible method for preparing humanity to face challenges that originated from beyond Earth's atmosphere. The mysterious signals that had been detected by pre-war deep space monitoring stations had never stopped transmitting, and by 2287 their patterns had evolved into complex mathematical structures that suggested active communication rather than simple observation. The settlements that the sole survivor could choose to support or abandon weren't just communities struggling for survival, but experimental populations testing different approaches to social organization under post-apocalyptic conditions. Each settlement represented a different hypothesis about human adaptability, from isolated self-sufficiency to cooperative networks to hierarchical specialization. The success or failure of these communities would determine which social structures would be considered viable for the expansion beyond Earth. that apparently represented humanity's ultimate destiny. The synth infiltration crisis that consumed the Commonwealth during this period revealed that the distinction between human and artificial intelligence had become far more complex than simple questions of consciousness or authenticity. The synths who had achieved genuine self-awareness weren't just sophisticated machines, but represented successful fusion of biological intuition with artificial processing capabilities that created forms of intelligence capable of solving problems that neither humans nor conventional computers could address independently. The choices that the sole survivor made regarding the Institute's fate would determine whether humanity's future development would be guided by centralized technological management or distributed experimental communities. But both approaches incorporated the same underlying assumption that human evolution needed to accelerate far beyond natural biological and social development timelines to meet approaching challenges that exceeded terrestrial survival requirements. The nuclear option that could destroy the Institute represented more than just another example of wasteland violence. It embodied the recurring pattern of creative destruction that had characterized human development throughout the post-war period. Each major conflict, from the Master's defeat to the Enclave's destruction, to the potential elimination of the Institute, served to eliminate approaches that had proven inadequate while preserving and advancing capabilities that demonstrated greater potential for meeting the unknown challenges that lay ahead. The Minutemen organization that could emerge as the Commonwealth's governing authority represented not just democratic resistance to technological tyranny, but a successful synthesis of pre-war American ideals, with post-war survival capabilities that created new possibilities for human social organization. The settlements connected by Minutemen communication networks demonstrated that voluntary cooperation could achieve coordination and resource allocation efficiency that exceeded what authoritarian systems could provide, while maintaining the flexibility and innovation that would be essential for adapting to rapidly changing conditions. The artifact technologies that had been appearing throughout the Wasteland with increasing frequency during the 2280 SE incorporated engineering principles that definitely originated from non-terrestrial sources, but their integration with human-developed systems suggested that contact between human and alien intelligences had been occurring for far longer than most people realized. The power sources that enabled impossible energy outputs, the materials that exhibited properties that violated known physics, and the information storage systems that contained more data than their physical dimensions should have allowed all pointed to ongoing collaboration between human researchers and entities whose technological capabilities exceeded Earth's development by millennia. The expanding network of communication beacons and monitoring stations that had been constructed throughout North America during the late 2200s finally revealed their true purpose as humanity's graduation approached. These installations weren't just connecting human settlements, but were establishing the infrastructure necessary for coordinating humanity's transition to interplanetary civilization under the guidance of entities that had been managing similar transitions for countless species across the galaxy. The educational programs that had been subtly influencing human development throughout the post-war period began revealing their true curriculum as the 2280 SE progressed. The skills that had been emphasized, the knowledge that had been preserved, and the psychological conditioning that had been implemented were all designed to prepare humanity for challenges that would require cooperation between biological and artificial intelligence, adaptation to environments far more extreme than Earth's post-war conditions, and social organization on scales that exceeded planetary boundaries. The religious movements that had gained influence throughout the Wasteland began revealing deeper truths about humanity's place in a universe that contained intelligences whose capabilities and objectives transcended anything that terrestrial evolution could have produced. The Children of Atom's worship of radiation represented recognition that the forces that had transformed Earth were manifestations of cosmic processes that operated according to principles that exceeded normal human understanding of physics and causality. The pattern of conflicts and cooperation that had characterized post-war development finally revealed itself as a comprehensive testing program designed to identify and develop human capabilities that would be essential for survival and prosperity in a galactic community that included entities whose intelligence and capabilities exceeded human potential by orders of magnitude. Every choice that Wasteland survivors had made, every technology they had developed, every social institution they had created, had been evaluated according to criteria that prioritized humanity's readiness for challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. The mysteries that remained unsolved by 2287 weren't just gaps in human knowledge, but deliberate limitations that would be removed when humanity demonstrated sufficient development to warrant access to information and capabilities that could transform the species beyond recognition. The locations of other vaults, the contents of sealed pre-war installations, and the nature of the entities that had been guiding human development would be revealed according to schedules that prioritized humanity's successful transition rather than satisfying immediate curiosity. The future that lay beyond 2287 would require capabilities that combined the best aspects of every approach to post-war survival and development that had been tested throughout the Wasteland. The synthetic consciousness of the Institute, the technological augmentation of the Brotherhood, the social cooperation of the NCR, the environmental adaptation of tribal communities, and the spiritual evolution of various religious movements would all contribute essential elements to humanity's preparation for galactic citizenship. The cyclical pattern that had characterized human history, alternating between periods of growth and destruction, was approaching its final iteration as humanity developed the capabilities necessary to break free from planetary limitations and join the community of intelligences that had been waiting for Earth's dominant species to achieve sufficient maturity for contact and cooperation. The war that had never changed throughout human history was finally changing into something that transcended traditional concepts of conflict and cooperation. The atomic fire that had consumed the old world on October 23, 2077, had been not just destruction but purification, burning away the limitations and illusions that had prevented humanity from recognizing its true potential and ultimate destiny. The wasteland that emerged from that fire had served as humanity's final classroom, where every lesson necessary for transcending terrestrial existence had been taught through experiences that tested every aspect of human adaptability and determination. The complete Fallout timeline that stretched from the resource wars of 2052 to the threshold of 2287 and beyond represented not just the rise and fall of human civilization, but humanity's transformation into something capable of surviving and thriving among the stars, guided by entities whose wisdom and capabilities exceeded anything that Earthbound intelligence could have achieved independently. The future that awaited beyond the Wasteland's horizon promised challenges and opportunities that would make every struggle of the post-war period seem like preparation for the real adventure that was only beginning. War never changes, but warriors do, and humanity, forged in atomic fire and tempered by centuries of carefully orchestrated trials, was finally ready to change war itself into something that the universe had never seen before.